British task force ditches in the sea and the crewman is killed. Back from Washington, Mr. Pym tells Mrs. Thatcher there's little chance of bridging the gap. The first fatal casualty of the Falklands expedition was a crewman from a Sea King helicopter which ditched in the sea. Petty Officer Kevin Stewart Casey, a married man from Portland in Dorset, is missing, presumed drowned. His wife is in the Wrens. According to reports from Argentina, some British ships have been sighted off South Georgia. Argentine naval sources claimed it was an attempt to intimidate the occupying troops, but not to make a landing. Our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne reports.
Petty Officer Casey was in the Sea King's main cabin when the crash occurred. The pilot was picked up by another helicopter from HMS Hermes, but despite an intensive search, there was no trace of his crewman. The Defence Ministry will hold an official inquiry into the cause of the crash, but bad weather probably had a lot to do with it. It's getting worse as the task force sails south, and it's making helicopter operations more hazardous. Today the forecast for South Georgia was wind gusting to 70 knots with 30-foot waves. The Defence Ministry have refused to comment on Argentine reports that these British warships are now lying off South Georgia with a Royal Marine landing party. But if they are there, the commandos will have to be ferried ashore by helicopter. Apart from rescuing the 15 British civilians still on the island, the main task will be to expel 100 Argentine Marines and formally re-establish British rule. South Georgia may be inhospitable, but it will provide the task force with a safe, deep anchorage and an operating base, and it's also beyond range of Argentine Air Force bombers. Meanwhile, at Portsmouth, work has been completed in converting the survey ships HMS Herald and HMS Hydra into casualty ferries. They've now sailed to join the second wave of the task force. Their job will be to ferry wounded troops from the Falklands beachhead to the hospital ship Uganda.
The Prime Minister has called an urgent meeting.
Argentines are prisoners. Between 80 and 90 are from the crippled submarine Santa Fe. In Washington, Argentine Foreign Minister Mr. Costa Mendez has said there can be no more negotiations for the time being, and he's postponed a meeting with the American Secretary of State. And there have been anti-British demonstrations in Buenos Aires.
Also, we see the anger of the crowds in Buenos Aires and hear the subdued reaction of the Argentine Foreign Minister. After South Georgia, we ask a former Marine General what the task force does next. And we also hope to speak to Labour's defence spokesman after this morning's shadow cabinet meeting. Here at home, Dame Celia Johnson, the actress, is dead. British forces have captured 200 Argentine prisoners of war in the first day of fighting on the island of South Georgia. British government sources giving this information this morning said that between 80 and 90 of them were from the submarine Santa Fe, crippled by helicopters in yesterday's landing on the island. One Argentine casualty is reported, a seaman who had his leg amputated. There are no British casualties. Tightening their hold on the island, the British troops have moved on Grytviken, which they captured in yesterday's fighting. Argentine resistance seems to be confined to smaller groups hiding in the interior. Argentina has admitted that its troops have retreated from their initial positions in face of what's described as overwhelming superiority, but says fighting goes on. The Argentine Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendez, has postponed his talks with the American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig. Mr. Costa Mendez, who said his country is now technically at war with Britain, is going before the Organization of American States in Washington this afternoon and is expected to seek help from member states. In Argentina, news of the British occupation of South Georgia leaked out only slowly yesterday. Towards the end of the day, feeling erupted into an anti-British demonstration in Buenos Aires. Michael Burke was there.
This demonstration was not called by the government, not carefully organized and encouraged. In fact, news of the British attack on South Georgia was delayed and then only allowed to dribble out here in stages. So the anger was real. Those that gathered in the Plaza de Mayo directed it in a very personal way at the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and then at the British generally. New slogans had been invented. Why kill one Englishman when you can kill three, and others unprintable in either language? The Argentine people had thought, right up until the last moment, that the British had been bluffing. They'd been told their troops in the Falklands were heroic and unbeatable. It wasn't just a few islands that were at stake, but a nation's pride. Hour after hour, cars circled the square here in the center of Buenos Aires, their horns honking Argentina. Officially controlled radio and television rationed news. First the attack, then it had been beaten off. Much later it had started again and been valiantly resisted. On each occasion, Britain was the aggressor. The trade in national flags was brisk. They are everywhere here. One of the few industries that thrives in a country whose economy is sliding downhill. And everywhere there was a feeling of disbelief.
They belong to us.
How do you feel about what the British have done?
Well, they are crazy. They are crazy, you know? We know for 150 years. They do the same thing all over in the world.
Why do you think they're crazy this time?
At this time, the same way. You see, we win. We win. All the way. Viva Argentina!
The demonstration continued long after night fell. By then, they still had not been told that South Georgia had fallen. As far as they were concerned, the battle was still going on. It wasn't until a few hours ago that the government here issued a communique saying that for practical reasons, communications with South Georgia had been cut. The initial triumph of the British forces had been because of their notable superiority in numbers. But the government claimed fighting was still going on in what it described as the interior zones of the island. Our troops have an unbreakable spirit of combat based on the moral superiority of those who defend the territory of their fatherland.
Official details of the successful British landing on South Georgia are still sparse. Grytviken was quickly taken and later Leith. Recently taken photographs, which the Royal Marines have just released, show men of the Royal Marines Special Boat Squadron who specialise in silent landings by canoe. It's believed that it was SBS men who first crept onto the island on Thursday for a reconnaissance. The SBS are the Marine equivalent of the Special Air Service. They claim to be able to do everything the SAS do. This is Leith Harbour in South Georgia. Pictures just made available by an amateur service cameraman. And this is Grytviken, the main centre, which was the first to be taken yesterday. And again, Leith, news that it too had been taken by the British landing force, came only this morning. Pictures that give some idea of the inhospitable conditions facing the Royal Marines yesterday. Film released by the Royal Marines shows a practice landing on terrain very much like that encountered in South Georgia. The Marines approached silently underwater, surfacing to survey the shore through binoculars. When they've got the protection of darkness, they paddle in for the first surprise landing. And then the main landing begins using fast-powered craft known as rigid raiders. The landing would be controlled from officers in the base ship, an aircraft carrier equipped with helicopters. Carrier shown in this recruiting or training film is the Hermes. That's not to say that she was necessarily the one involved in yesterday's real-life landing. From the helicopters, 2 men can be landed directly onto an island. Finally, the practice film shows the final stages of a complete seaborne invasion, with landing craft in formation going in for a mass landing of the Royal Marine Commandos onto the hostile shore. Well, now for the latest news from the Ministry of Defence about the captured Argentines. We're going over now to our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
Well, Ian, we don't yet know whether the pictures that you've just seen do represent the kind of landing which was launched on South Georgia. because there's been a complete security clampdown on details of the raid, and that will be enforced until after this afternoon's ministerial statements. However, government sources have revealed that 200 Argentines have so far been captured, and that includes between 80 and 90 from the damaged Argentine submarine Santa Fe, which was wrecked by Royal Navy helicopters during the initial stages of the landing. We also know that the only reported casualty, an Argentine crewman, has had his leg amputated. That is a remarkably low toll, and it does show how, bearing in mind how much firepower was available to the Royal Marines, it shows how closely they stuck to their orders to try to keep casualties to a minimum. Well, this afternoon we'll hear the definitive version of the raid at a special televised press conference to be held here at the Defence Ministry shortly after 4 o'clock. And then we'll know the answers to some of the questions, including the role of the Special Boat Squadron. Now, back to the studio.
Chris, thank you. Well, Britain now has an important bargaining counter in South Georgia to continue diplomatic negotiations with Argentina. The island provides a useful springboard to the Falkland Islands themselves, 800 miles away in the South Atlantic. To discuss the military possibilities, we've been joined in the studio by a former commander of Royal Marine Commandos, Major General John Owen. Is it really a springboard? Is there any connection between a landing in South Georgia and a possible extension to the Falklands?
I would say so. This is a first phase of an operation of this sort. It will be an enormous fillip to the morale of the force, who will have seen dry land for the first time for several days. The ability to get ashore and to fight a relatively easy operation will be extremely good for the British forces as a whole. So that's as far as South Georgia is concerned. As for the future, I would think this is the next step is up to the politicians. There must be some pressure put on the Argentinians because of this landing. It shows the British resolve to do something.
So you would see a substantial pause now while diplomatic negotiations continue?
That would be my guess, yes.
Where do you think these Marines came from? Do you think they came off the Hermes?
I would think it's very likely that they did. The Hermes has the ability to carry a large force, as we saw when they embarked. It carries the helicopters and has the necessary communications to control such a force.
And would you think that their training in Norway makes the South Georgian operation comparatively easy for them?
I don't know about easy, but it certainly makes it easier. The training in Norway, which of course is done under the NATO auspices, they'll stand in extremely good stead. They will be equipped, they'll have the clothing, and they have the training to operate in conditions like this. South Georgia and the Falkland Islands about this time of the year are really like Norway in January and February. And perhaps the biggest danger to troops in this sort of climate is the wind chill factor. And unless they are equipped and clothed to counter this, then of course illness and death can result.
Are you surprised at the number of prisoners they've taken? 200?
Well, reading the papers, I thought there were about 100 there, so perhaps it is a slight surprise, yes. No. Although if I were the Argentinians, I would want that number there to make a reasonable force.
Thank you very much indeed.
Among the several thousand commandos and paratroopers sailing with the task force are the 36 Royal Marines forced to surrender during the Argentine invasion of the Falklands. As Jeremy Hands aboard the troop ship Canberra reports, they were eager to go back.
They'd all asked to go back to the Falklands, and as quickly as they could be turned round, they were going back. The 36 Royal Marines were flown to join the Canberra to be back with their colleagues and to have the chance, if the chance arises, to be the first ashore and reclaim what was taken from them. In new kit and with new weapons, they joined the rest of the Marines in high spirits. And with the newcomers, a very special memento from Port Stanley. This flag used to fly over the governor's residence and was taken down long before the Argentines arrived. These men have just one aim, to put it back where it came from.
How important is it to you personally that the Marines go back and get back what was taken from them?
Well, it's very important. I think it's important for any bloke who's in the forces. If he suffers a defeat, the first thing he wants to do is get back and show him, that it wasn't his fault that they were defeated.
Can I finally ask you, what reason particularly makes you want to come back?
Well, when we actually got sent back to the airport, as we were driving past, we were sent back to the APC, back to the airport, and you could see the civilians looking through the windows and looked so worried, and you felt, if though you'd let them down in some way. But like I say, that's the reason why I wanted to go back, and I think that's what the reason why most of the blokes want to go back.
Now the 36 Marines will slip back into their units and pick up their training with the 2,000 other men on board. And their first-hand knowledge of Argentine soldiers is already proving invaluable.
In Washington, there's still hope that diplomacy may prevent war between Britain and Argentina, even though the Argentine foreign minister has said that technically a state of war does now exist. Mr. Costa Mendes should have seen Mr. Haig, the Secretary of State, yesterday, but still hasn't done so. In a few hours' time, he'll be meeting fellow members of the Organization of American States. From Washington, Martin Bell.
It was a State Department meeting set up for 4 o'clock, but 5 o'clock came and nothing happened. 6 o'clock, the same. And Mr. Costa Mendes finally came down nearly 2 hours later to his hotel lobby to announce that the meeting with Mr. Haig was postponed and there'd be no negotiations whatever with the British.
Today we have been surprised by the British attack to the Georgia Island. Britain has so violated not only Resolution 502 from the Security Council, it has also violated basic principles about negotiation. We were negotiating with Britain through the United States of America. For us means no negotiation with Britain for the time being.
So this is the end of with the Secretary of State?
I must say that I'm very grateful to the really very extraordinary task that the Secretary of State has fulfilled, fighting for the cause of peace.
Under what circumstances could negotiations be renewed?
I cannot give you those circumstances. This is part of a negotiation, a private reserved negotiation.
Mr. Minister, is it possible to prevent an all-out conflict between Britain and Argentina?
I think that we can prevent the conflict yet.
How?
Are you saying that there will be no military retaliation on the part of Argentina?
I cannot say that. Don't put words in my mouth, please.
Mr. Costa Mendes then left in a commotion of journalists for a private dinner with friends. And it is among friends that he hopes to be again today for a vitally important meeting of the OAS. The Organization of American States, mainly Hispanic and mainly sympathetic to Argentina, decided at its last session to convene a foreign ministers' meeting to consider invoking the Rio Treaty, the Hemisphere's Defense Pact. It could be just a political platform, but could be a call for economic or even military sanctions. And for Argentina, the loss of South Georgia is a call to political battle stations.
At home, the Shadow Cabinet was meeting this morning to decide what Labour's policy should be to the news that South Georgia has been retaken. Up to now, Labour have been arguing for a peaceful settlement to be achieved through negotiations. The Labour defence spokesman is Mr. John Silkin, and he's now with our political correspondent, Brian Curtoys.
Mr. Silkin, what...
Party unity over the Falkland crisis crumbles amid angry clashes in Parliament. The Defence Ministry clamped down on news of the task force amid speculation that an attack on the Falklands is imminent. Argentina's foreign minister says it could happen within the next 48 hours. And Mr. Haig's offer to return to Buenos Aires is rejected by the junta. Good evening. After a fierce row in the House of Commons, Mrs. Thatcher tonight seems to be on the point of losing the support of the opposition for her tough approach to the Falklands crisis. And there's speculation that the order for the invasion of the Falklands may already have been given. HMS Intrepid is on her way to join the task force, and the Argentines are expecting an invasion within the next day or two. It's been confirmed the Pope sent a message to the Queen pleading for a peaceful settlement, but the diplomatic machinery seems to be grinding to a halt. Mr. Haig's apparently been told not to bother returning to Buenos Aires, but they say they listen to whatever President Reagan has to say. Mr. Foote demanded in the Commons that Britain's Foreign Secretary should fly to New York to bring the United Nations back into the peace process. And it was that which led to the row between the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister. At the height of the exchange, Mr. Foote told Mrs. Thatcher, "If you don't make a proper response to the United Nations peace appeal, you will inflict a grievous blow to our cause." But Mrs. Thatcher would not rule out further military action. That would put many of our soldiers and sailors in jeopardy, she said. 5 times Mr. Foote went to the dispatch box to try to get Mrs. Thatcher to change her mind.
I say to the Right Honourable Lady, say to her as straight as I can, I say to her, if she does not make a proper response to this appeal from the Secretary-General of the United Nations, who is entitled to make such an appeal under the Constitution of the United Nations itself, if she does not make a proper response along the lines I have suggested, either by the Foreign Secretary or somebody else going to New York to discuss it, if she does not, and I put it in that hypothetical manner, but if she does not, she will inflict a grievous blow on our country's cause, and I hope she will consider the matter properly.
I must say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I totally disagree, that if we were to refuse to take any further military action whatsoever during this negotiation, then he would be putting many of our soldiers and sailors in jeopardy.
Can I say to the responsibility in this matter rests with the Right Honourable Lady and with the rest of us in the House of Commons. I ask the Right Honourable Lady but not to make any steps further in the escalation of these military matters, and to give this House of Commons the chance of deciding what should be the proper response to the appeal from the Secretary-General. I ask her not to take any military action and to take this diplomatic action after she's consulted with the House of Commons.
No, Mr. Speaker, I will stand by the terms of the United Nations resolution and of the United Nations Charter, and until the terms of that resolution are complied with, namely that the Argentine forces withdraw, we shall continue to exercise our rights under Article 51, and in reply to the Right Honourable Gentleman, my reply to the Secretary-General is to urge him, as well as to urge the Right Honourable Gentleman, to address his remarks to the junta in Argentine.
Mrs Thatcher's unyielding response to Mr Foote convinced most Labour MPs and some Conservatives that she's already committed to an invasion of the Falkland Islands. Downing Street claims that the occasion of this quarrel is trivial. The Prime Minister wrote to the opposition leader this evening, saying that the UN Secretary-General's appeal came only in a press handout, not in any formal message to London. But the consequences weren't at all trivial. They amounted to a shattering of the political consensus at Westminster. Now, there's never been a bipartisan policy with Labour, of course. A shadow minister this evening preferred to call it, with fastidious precision of language, a coincidence of view. Well, that's badly battered too. Labour's now very angry at what it sees as the change in Mrs Thatcher's tone since her call to the nation to rejoice on television on Sunday night. They think she's abandoned any thought of action through the United Nations if Mr Hague's mission finally ends. Dennis Healy's due back from America tomorrow, and his return is likely to confirm Labour's view that the UN Secretary-General should be given a chance before a military attack on the Falklands themselves. Mr Foote spoke to a disarmament lobby at Westminster this afternoon.
We have an immediate crisis on our hands, on the world's hands, here at this moment. I do not say it is a crisis directly concerned with nuclear weapons, and I trust it never will be. But it is a crisis of considerable dimensions, and one that especially concerns this country, and one that especially concerns the authority of the United Nations. And I believe one of the paramount guides of our steps and our leaders' steps during these next few days and few weeks must be to abide strictly by the rights and the claims of the Charter of the United Nations.
The divisions weren't only between the two largest parties. Differences of emphasis have also emerged between the Social Democrats and the Liberals. Dr David Owen, the tough-minded former Foreign Secretary, is determined that the SDP will follow the government to the brink because he sees that as the best chance of getting a negotiated settlement. But the Liberals, like Labour, would like to try for peace through the UN. Mr David Steele showed his dissatisfaction in a speech at Sutton in Surrey this evening.
The only person consulted outside the inner war cabinet is the chairman of the Conservative Party. And this, in my view, is wholly improper. If we have to make a choice between accepting a diplomatic compromise or committing our forces to a necessarily bloody battle, that is a choice on which, on Privy Council terms, the leaders of the other parties should be consulted in a round-table discussion. Because without such consultation, I am not willing to commit Liberal Party support to escalating military conflict.
The government, understandably, is keeping its military cards very close to its chest. Whitehall sources this evening insisted that Mr. Haig's peace mission was still very much in being. Military escalation was in the eye of the beholder, they said, though if all else failed, they didn't rule out the use of other means than diplomacy. All of which means that the government is still hoping for a diplomatic miracle, but isn't prepared to wait much longer for it to happen.
The Foreign Secretary, Francis Pym, has spent the day in Luxembourg discussing not just the Falklands crisis, but also Britain's EEC budget payments. On the Falklands, he told Common Market foreign ministers that the American peace mission was still very much in force, and Britain was doing all it could to achieve a peaceful settlement. In return, said Mr. Pym, the foreign ministers gave him very robust support. Kate Adey is in Luxembourg.
Events in the South Atlantic reached into Luxembourg today as the 10 foreign ministers put aside the tangled wranglings of internal budget problems to endorse British action over the Falklands. But Mr. Pym, first of all, wanted to declare that he was a convinced European, in the slightly limited British sense of the word, and that he was ready to immerse himself in the confusing flow of arguments over British payments to the common market, despite the inescapable shadow of the Falklands. To this end, he spelled out Britain's demands for a long-term solution to her budget payments yet again, emphasizing that though the British Foreign Secretary may have changed in the last 3 weeks, British policy hasn't. Over lunch, Mr. Pym brought his colleagues up to date about the latest situation in the Falklands, and he thanked them for their continued support. There seemed to have been no dissenting voices, and no doubts raised over the use of force in the retaking of South Georgia. Common market sanctions continue, and Britain is assured of complete common market backing. But when the meeting appeared to end rather early with little progress on internal problems, had there been any pressure on Mr. Pym to return support for Britain's Falklands policy with British concessions on budget repayments?
No suggestion of that kind. No, not at all. But may I say that I do think it is very important for the community that this budget matter should be resolved quickly. And as I say, the basis upon which I want to see that done is a basis that is fair to the whole community as well as to Britain.
So the talks about money go on, with Mr. Pym confident he was in the right place today, consulting with Europe, rather than pursuing foreign policy elsewhere.
I'm extremely glad to be here, despite some other rather onerous preoccupations. But the fact that I am, in the circumstances here, underlines the great importance which I attach to the community. It's very important that the solidarity that we have shown in recent months and years should be maintained.
So he returns to London, knowing that 9 European countries may be still a long way from his view of the budget problem, but that they're right behind him in the Falklands crisis.
The Argentine Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendes, has said his government has received information that the British task force may attack the Falklands in the next 24 hours. But the Argentines have turned down an offer by the American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, to return to Buenos Aires to continue his peace efforts. They say he wants to discuss new peace proposals from President Reagan, but they argue that the details can be just as easily brought back from Washington by Mr. Costa Mendes. He spent a second day at the meeting of the Organization of American States, warning of the increasing gravity of the crisis. Martin Bell is in Washington.
Time may be running out in the South Atlantic, but not at the OAS. Delegates arrived for another day's talking as if they had all the time in the world. Mr. Costa Mendes, no longer negotiating, was relishing instead the support of a body that sounded at times like Argentina's own supporters club. This was the standing ovation for his first speech, and in a forum where Britain's case, of course, went unheard, the rhetoric ran on interminably, with only Mr. Haig injecting a note of urgency.
It is quite clear that the crisis has reached a critical point. New military action has taken place. Unless a settlement can be found in the next few days, more intensive fighting is likely to occur.
And as Mr. Costa-Mendez returned to the conference room a short while ago, it seemed he'd got the same message. Things weren't going Argentina's way anymore. Not only was the Colombian delegate breaking ranks, opposing Argentina's use of force, but more seriously, events were moving in the South Atlantic.
The latest information received assure me that within a few hours, perhaps only 24 hours or perhaps 48 hours, an attack of the aggressor against the Islas Malvinas might take place. So that were the case, a possibility of warlike development of equal magnitude in the South Atlantic, or it's assuming continental dimensions, is very serious. The situation is most grave, sir.
He then asked the OAS to speed up its work in a session that seems to have served so far only to keep him from the negotiating table. Negotiations haven't resumed. Mr. Haig still hasn't got his invitation to go back to Buenos Aires. There is a sense here on all sides of impending conflict, and yet the diplomats aren't doing anything about it. They're just making and listening to speeches.
With transatlantic diplomacy showing so few signs of progress, speculation has grown in London that Britain's task force is now poised to invade the Falklands. And tonight, Mr. Rex Hunt, the Falklands governor deported by the Argentines, told a meeting of MPs he thought the islanders would risk the loss of property and life in a British invasion if that were the only way of getting the Argentines out. The MPs were also told that all the children have been moved out of Port Stanley, and only 150 Falklanders remain, half of them old people, unable to move in the event of an attack. Our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne, reports on the day's developments.
This morning, the Ministry of Defence applied what amounted to a partial news blackout. There'll be no comment of any kind on the movements or disposition of the task force. That could mean the Times report is true. Equally, it could be intended to confuse the Argentines. But it has increased speculation about an imminent landing in the Falklands. The British plans for retaking the islands are top secret. So too is the timing. But both Argentine and British intelligence staffs have weighed together the same factors, and all of them point to early action. This is one possible scenario.
Firstly, the Argentines have discovered that the Falklands are almost indefensible. They cover an area nearly as big as Wales. There are no roads outside the capital, Port Stanley, and troops can only be moved quickly by helicopter. The same applies to food and water. So although they've got several thousand troops dug in around various possible landing zones, they face huge logistic problems. Secondly, the Argentines know that the two carriers and their jump jets mean the British don't have to grab Port Stanley airfield. Harriers don't need conventional airstrips. Thirdly, they know the British have a wide choice of landing places and that the Argentine forces are unlikely to be able to concentrate quickly enough to prevent a beachhead from being seized. And finally, they know that the Argentine Air Force can only operate in daylight and good weather. It's now late autumn in the Falklands, the nights are drawing in, and sudden rain squalls can blot out the islands.
Put all those factors together, and what emerges is a night attack on several places in the West Falklands. The most likely point is here at the Weddell settlement, and possibly directly opposite on the island of West Falkland itself. Now, if that were to happen, it would mean that the Argentine battalion of about 800 men reported to be dug in here at Fox Bay could be bombed and shelled into submission. At the same time, on East Falkland, there could be an airstrike against the airport to crater the runway, and the harbour at Port Stanley itself could be mined. Of course, it's only one possible plan. Admiral Woodward has several other options open to him. But three factors have emerged which point to the West Falklands as the target for an early attack. A strike now cuts the ground from under President Galtieri's feet. It reduces the risk to civilians, and the Prime Minister has already let it be known that she favours action sooner rather than later.
The swift, almost bloodless recapture of South Georgia has been described by the Admiral who commanded it as just the run-up to the big match, the invasion of the Falklands themselves. Our reporter with the fleet, Brian Hanrahan, has been talking to Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward aboard his flagship Hermes.
The Admiral described the South Georgia operation as the run-up to the big match, which he expected to be a walkover. On South Georgia, he said the task force had acted swiftly with little safety margin, trading security for speed and success. but there'd be no trade-off when they turned to the Falklands. Admiral Woodward said he'd been surprised how quickly the opposition had surrendered. We were led to believe they were a tough lot, but they soon threw in their hand when 4.5-inch shells started whanging about them. They could expect a repeat performance in the Falklands. The success of the South Georgia operation had been a tremendous boost for his men, the Admiral said. Early success was always heartwarming. He now had a secure base with sheltered waters out of reach of the Argentine Air Force. Store ships, hospital ships could ride out the Antarctic storms. Warships could even carry out repairs. Not as good as a Royal Dockyard, he said, but a considerable asset. We're now well advanced into the roaring 40s. The strong winds whipping up the grey waters, the temperatures falling daily. From his seat below the bridge, Admiral Woodward looked out at the full task force formed up round him and said, "This is the heavy punch. As we get closer, the options become fewer. The sands are running out." And he finished with a warning to the Argentinian troops on the Falklands. "If you want to get out, I suggest you do so now. Once we arrive, the only way home will be courtesy of the Royal Navy."
The Argentine government is still claiming resistance has been continuing on South Georgia. It says Special Forces troops are holding their positions. There have been casualties on both sides, and a British helicopter was shot down. Argentina's military commanders are stepping up preparations for a possible British attack on the Falklands. In Comodoro Rivadavia, all foreign journalists have been given 48 hours to leave for security reasons. The port is regarded as an important staging area for the shipment of troops and supplies to the islands. And Marines who took part in the original invasion are being held in readiness, as Christopher Morris reports.
The Marines will be the first to be sent into battle with the British, in support of the 10,000 troops already well dug in and defending the Falklands. But should British troops launch an invasion, it will take at least 8 hours to land these Marines back on the islands, and that could prove a critical factor.
If he invades now, you can be sure it will be a very, very bloody operation. And I'm afraid, including the civilian people.
The Admiral claims Britain has overreacted to Argentina's invasion of the Falklands, so now Argentine forces are preparing to strike back. The Marines' Amphibious Battalion claims it can launch a counterattack against the British forces on South Georgia at any time. Sunday's attack on the island has created a state of total war. Mobilization of troops and equipment continues, and morale remains high. The Argentine troops are now on a war footing, ready to be called into action at any moment.
There have been more demonstrations in Argentina's cities supporting President Galtieri and denouncing Britain, although in Buenos Aires there appeared to be some criticism too of the Argentine government. Several thousand turned out for a rally organised by trade unions, and there was no doubting the depth of anti-British feeling. Here's Christopher Morris again.
They banged their drums in protest, and they worked themselves up into a war frenzy. Thousands of demonstrators crammed into the Plaza del Mayo to shout their abuse at Britain. They even paraded a banner caricaturing Mrs. Thatcher as the devil. God, it declared, doesn't protect the evil. There wasn't much protection for the banner. It was pelted, stamped upon, then torn to shreds.
This is the second day running. There have been demonstrations here in the center of Buenos Aires. And with these, the angry realization that British forces have recaptured South Georgia.
The square definitely wasn't a safe place for any Britons to venture, with the mood so ugly. The crowd surged around an American television crew, mistaking them for British journalists. They were taken away in a police car for their own protection. The band and once powerful Peronist union had called a strike to hold this anti-British protest. For years, the left-wing trades unions have been battling against Argentina's military government over inflation and unemployment. But this time, Argentina's economic plight was mostly forgotten. and they were united in denouncing so-called British aggression in South Georgia and America's role as a mediator in the dispute. It was the biggest demonstration for years by the supporters of the late Argentine dictator, General Juan Perón, watched appreciatively by a soldier on the roof of the presidential palace. Significantly, though, General Galtieri did not appear before the crowd, and there were some tense moments when it seemed this demonstration might turn into a protest against the junta, with anti-government banners and noisy demands for an end to military rule. But the mood was mainly a war fever, with the people demanding revenge against Britain.
The troops expected to form the garrison on the Falklands, if they're recaptured, have been taking part in a major training exercise in the Welsh mountains. They're the 3,000 infantrymen from 5 Brigade, which specialises in operations outside the NATO area. Their exercise was brought forward by a month. Nicola Haywood-Thomas was there to watch it.
5 Brigade, made up of 3 battalions, is maintained to work outside the NATO defence area. 2 of its battalions have already been sent to the South Atlantic, so this week's exercise, arranged at short notice, is designed to train the replacements to fit in and get to know the brigade's procedures. Today's exercise was a demonstration of firepower using live ammunition. The brigade's mortars were backed up by RAF Harriers and Jaguars, which continued the attack on the supposed enemy headquarters, firing Sneb rockets. Normally on such an exercise, blanks are used, but it's an indication of how important these manoeuvres are to the brigade that not only did today's exercise involve live ammunition, but the troops have also been at extensive shooting practice after dark.
Now the main points of the other news. Unemployment has gone over 3 million again. The Queen Mother has visited Northern Ireland, where another UDR man's been shot dead, and England's footballers are ahead against Wales. First, unemployment. The number of people out of work in Britain has climbed back above.
Task Force, the home front.
It was about lunchtime, just before lunchtime. This friend phoned me up and said, she said, my God, we've just heard on the radio or on television that the Argentines have actually invaded. And I nearly dropped us, the bastards.
Mr. Speaker, sir. The House meets this Saturday to respond to a situation of great gravity. We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the whole House will join me in condemning totally this unprovoked aggression by the government of Argentina against British territory.
I mean, it was just out of the blue and ordinary. I mean, Friday was going to be on leave and he'd been home every day and we could have just done exactly what we wanted to do for the next 14 days. And now he's gone, that's it.
And Saturday afternoon, knock, knock. And I was left holding his cup of coffee. He'd gone.
That's when it started frightening me, when I realised it wasn't just a game, a war game, that they were actually going off to perhaps fight.
My husband is in a turret, and he can blow up a moving target. He can blow up something 20 miles away. You couldn't do that in the Second World War. You had to see your enemy. Now you don't. I'm worried, not for my husband, but for all the men that have gone. Little boys, young men and everything. And a lot of people say, I've got friends that their husbands have been in the war, for Second World War, and I know people that have been in the Second World War. And they say, our men have been out there fighting, but this is a different war. This is a different war altogether.
The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. is the government's objective to see that the islands are freed from occupation and are returned to British administration at the earliest possible moment.
As the ship turned round the bend, there was a roar from the crowd. Now, I couldn't find a roar inside me. I just couldn't. No, I couldn't stand there and even cheer. wave. And this chap turned round and said, well, about time they showed a bit of, you know, a bit of pride and a bit of British, all the rest of it. And I thought, you're standing there with your wife. You'll be going home with your wife and watching television with your wife. And we'll be going home to an empty house.
No,
you know, I couldn't. I waved, and I don't know how I got my hand up there. But I couldn't feel the happiness and the elation of all of this, the going off to sea. And I couldn't.
No, I couldn't.
Oh.
Monday, April the 6th, 1982. The fleet is gone and the families are alone. There are more than 5,000 naval families living on a dozen housing complexes in Portsmouth and neighbouring Gosport and Fareham. It's going to be a testing time for all of them. Portsmouth has been described as the city where the British Navy was born, and its history as a naval port goes back to the year 1415. It was from here that Nelson set sail in HMS Victory for the last time in 1805. And of course, the city played an important role in the First and Second World Wars.
Officially, the Navy has told me nothing. They haven't told me or anyone else from that lot of ships that went out that they've actually gone there. Not officially. No one's actually come to my door and said, excuse me, your husband's gone with the task force.
Those that have more experience, you know, that have perhaps been married longer to servicemen, are perhaps a little more geared to this and understand that separation and unusual circumstances is part of the way of life. I think a lot of the younger ones are taken back and confused, but all or most of them have reacted in the way we would expect. I mean, a serviceman's wife, his family, they all have to share this.
It's the waiting, it's not knowing what's going on. The men on the Invincible and the Hermes, their families are hearing little snippets on the news. But as far as my husband's ship is concerned, and all the Glamorgan and all those other ships of Coventry, they might as well have been wiped off the face of the earth. Now we've got no navy here. If a country like Argentina can walk into the Falklands and get away with it, can you imagine the vulnerability of England at this moment? We've got absolutely no one here almost. There's hardly a man in sight. I know the ships do go out, you know, and large consignments of men go all at once, but never like this, never like this. It's like a ghost town.
Liz Conacher is one of the women of the home front. A mother of two, she works at an old people's home 4 days a week. A few weeks ago, her husband Brian, a gunnery expert, was shore-based. Now, on April the 7th, he's on the task force, along with his friends and neighbours, like Tom Ord on the left.
You get quite a few girls living on the estate, husbands on the same ship, normally, and you find that you stick together with the girls, with the husbands on the same ship. But this crisis has brought everybody together, so we're all in the same boat, as you could put it, you know. So we're all pulling together, you know. If anybody's got a panic on, we all try and help out.
Leslie Haar is 21 years old. She's been married for 2 years and has a 10-month-old baby, Emma. She's accustomed to separation from her husband, able seaman George Haar. That is an accepted part of their marriage, a fact of naval life. But Leslie didn't really believe he'd ever see active service.
I haven't really thought about him having to fight. Being that he's naval, I've tended to put it to the back of my mind, hoping that, you know, I mean, it's the Marines that have to go from ship to shore, and I'm just hoping that maybe he'll stay on board and, you know, that he won't have to actually go and fight.
But if anything happened?
What, that he did have to go and fight? Well, obviously I'd be very upset, but I can't really say what my immediate reaction would be.
Susan Dickinson, an American, lives in her own house in Fareham with her 2-year-old son, Scott. Her husband, Phil, is a lieutenant and observer on a Sea King helicopter. He could be in the thick of any battle involving submarines.
He's gone off. He joined the Navy under his own steam. It's not, well, when he made his pledge to serve the Queen and country, he made the pledge himself, and I married him knowing that.
He's quite well acquainted with the Falkland Island situation, isn't he?
Yes, 4 years ago, when this secret deployment went off, he was on it, and it only just came out last Friday when David Owen was talking that these ships, and he mentioned the ships, and I know which one my husband was on, so I know he went down to the Falklands 4 years ago at Christmas. And at the time it was a secret. He never told me where he'd been, but I think if you knew the political situation at the time, it was fairly obvious that they probably had gone there.
In the Dickinson household, even Kerry the dog is being affected.
When he came home this time, and then there was this flurry of activity, she was really upset, and all day Saturday she was terrible, very nervous, and Sunday she was so bad I had to give her a tranquilizer. Now her hair started falling out. I know it sounds funny, but everybody's reacting to this, not just me. My husband is British and my child is British, and I live in this country, so I'm as much a part of it as anybody else whose husband has gone away. Anybody who joins the armed services realizes that they will at one time perhaps be called upon to be a pawn in a political game. It's not easy to accept, and I can say it now, and if anything happens to him, I'm sure I will feel a lot more strongly about it, but it is his job. It's a job he's trained for.
Let us look for peace, the peace of Christ, the peace that passeth all understanding. And it is good that we are here today to remember our fleet that have sailed to represent our country, and to remember our families, the families of the men that have gone. Let us pray that there might be joy in their hearts, despite the task that is ahead.
Hello. Listen, did you hear the news just now? I can hear that phone before it rings, you know. It's in my head, and I can I'm up and halfway at the door before the damn thing goes. Well, they took, I think it was...
Watching anxiously on the home front are the Falkland Islanders themselves. Joyce and John Allen came back to Britain 5.5 years ago, leaving behind them 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren.
I just heard this yell, it's from the Falklands, and I sort of think I had the phone out of his hand before he sort of hardly picked it up. And it was Rosemary. I was so glad to hear her actually speaking that I couldn't think what the hell I wanted to say again. I was sort of saying, you all right? Are you all right? Well, obviously, if they're talking on the end of the phone, they're all right. We did ask her what she thought the general opinion there was of the fleet going, and she said she would prefer not to answer. And I know that other people have had phone calls, people here in Southampton anyway as well, and they've asked the same question of their relatives there, and they've all said that they would rather not answer that, so obviously they don't want to sort of give anything away.
The Argentine Navy patrols the Falklands as Britain prepares to blockade the islands. The American Secretary of State is on his way to Buenos Aires with a tough British message: we'll shoot first. The Falklands crisis entered its second week with the focus on American diplomacy. As both
but your 8,000, or the Falkland Islands, is 8,000 miles away. Can we really be expected to look after you from that distance?
That's right, you can. That's your commitment. That's what we are. We're part of you. We could just be at the Isle of Wight for all that matters. We didn't think of that in 1914 and 1939. England is home to us, and that's what it was then, and we expect today that we're in trouble, that the Falklands is likewise going to be home to you.
But it's no bloody good having the land if you're dead. If they blast the hell out of it and keep the Falklands, it'll be a bloody graveyard, and what use is that? It's no good to anybody. That's how I feel about it. Plus the fact that, I mean, every day that fleet's going out, I can sort of go with it each day, and, you know, I can imagine the weather getting rougher and poor little devils being seasick and all this kind of thing, because they're only kids anyway, half of them. And sort of getting there, I mean, all kinds of hell are going to be blasted out of them as well. I realise the wider implications and the fact that Britain had to have a show of force, but I certainly would never like to see it come to a shooting war. Not at all.
Got to be very realistic about this. It's not only the lives of the 1,800 Falkland Islanders at stake. The whole world has got their eyes on this situation. It's just hard lines. My family's in the middle of it now. And as a family, we've just got to face the consequences. We're fighting for the rights of the free world at this time, whichever way it goes. My heart bleeds for the crews of those ships, for the armed forces, for their wives, their sweethearts, their parents. Likewise for my own family, my own children, my friends and the full population in the Falkland Islands. But I've got to be realistic. If we're going to back down to a dictator, an aggressor who can just come in and invade our countries, it doesn't matter whose it is, that's worth fighting for.
The only record you can get a can from, that's Gordon Giltrap. Nearly made the top 20 back in 1978, but not quite.
Radio 1 News. Britain's blockade of the Falkland Islands came into force just over 3 hours ago. The Navy are under orders to shoot first if they...
Well, I'm still a little bit apprehensive, obviously. You know, we're just going to play it along and see who cracks first, I suppose.
Areas where it would be difficult for British submarines to attack them and where there'd be rapid aerial defense cover. Instead of exposing its naval forces to British attack, Argentina is turning the occupied islands...
If anything happens to Phil, I don't know how I'll explain to him that Daddy's not coming back again. So that will be difficult.
A few hundred miles away.
Meanwhile, an unconfirmed report says that Argentina will withdraw her troops.
The news is so different. You know, one day it's more worrying than others. Then some day you have a little bit of hope one day that they're not going to have a battle, and then, you know, another day it sounds like they will. So, you know, I'm not scared at the moment, but when he gets there, I'll probably be more scared.
The slightest spark could sort of send anything off. Everybody's going to be all that more jumpy, all that more tense. The people in the Falklands as well as everybody else.
Now I'm becoming increasingly concerned with every single report I hear.
Mr. Alexander Haig sets out yet again on his peace mission, this time heading back to Argentina. He says himself it's now a difficult and dangerous situation.
Actually, I'm getting sick of hearing about it on the news. Every single thing I hear is Falklands, Falklands, Falklands. I'd like to just forget about it for a while. Not that I forget about Phil, but I'd like to pretend in my own mind that he's just away, like he's away all the other times, and we can get on and live a day without having to worry about it all day long.
Yes, but on the other hand, you do want, you know, to know what is going on.
Yes, I want to know once during the day, but I don't want to know every half an hour during the day.
You want to know if something has actually happened or something has changed.
Yes.
But there's an awful lot of speculation that goes on.
Yes.
Probably
that's the
today will
worrying
be no
part.
different from yesterday, but we'll still have sort of a 20-minute news bulletin on it, and yet nothing will have changed. You won't have heard from Phil or from Steve, I suppose.
Well, yes, I wrote to Phil last night, said it's like writing to a bottomless pit. Because you just write and write, but you can't ask questions, you can't do anything, you can't ask advice, you can tell him what's going on,
It's
literally.
quite hard not getting any mail, in fact.
Oh, yes.
Because I do feel totally cut off.
Yes, I think that is the hurtful. I think everybody.
That's why you need friends at a time like this. You've got to have your friends who are going through the same thing.
But you have to get on with it. That's life, isn't it?
Do you know what made me cross yesterday is listening to the news and hearing the American ambassador to the UN say, well, if the Argentinians own the Falklands in the first place, they're not really invading it when they put their troops on there. Oh, I was so mad when I heard that.
Yes.
It's our anniversary and Emma's first Easter, which was quite a shame for George. And also we had Emma's christening booked for the beginning of May, which we've had to cancel now. And she's 11 months now. Well, she would have been 11 months in May. And she's going to be quite old when we get her christened. So that was a bit of a shame, you know, because we had relations coming and everything. So it's all had to be cancelled.
Considerable care has been taken at baby clinics like this one in Rauna to ensure that young mothers with husbands away are looked after. The Navy itself has increased its welfare staff by 40 in Portsmouth, and the 20 information centres are working overtime to make sure that all calls and inquiries are properly dealt with. In several areas, groups of wives have banded together and formed what they've called Task Force Lonely Hearts Clubs. There are regular meetings with naval chaplains, and the Navy's 68 social workers and community visitors have never had such a busy time.
They need all the support that they can get. I mean, after all, they're our husbands, they're the father of our children, which are a future generation, and so I think they deserve, and for their morale, and probably for us as well, that they should get that support. But I honestly could be more prouder of them. I really couldn't. I think they're...
That's what I wrote.
Really?
I wrote and said I was jolly proud of them. We're here, we can't do a thing about it. And we know our husbands are out there, and if they can't set out between them, it's their lives at risk. I just feel so anxious.
Well, that's it. It's looking dodgy every day. We're all just sitting here waiting for this news to come out, and it's just looking worse every day. Just hoping they can get something sorted out with these talks.
What about you, Jackie?
Oh, God, well... Oh, upset. Just upset. Just... 2 weeks ago, we were all sitting here, just thinking, I've got my leave and I'm going to decorate the living room. And
Everything's just gone up the chute, hasn't it?
This doesn't seem real to me. Just don't seem real. It don't. It could be anywhere, but this lot just
seems
don't
like a bad
seem
dream, and you're
real.
just going to wake up in the morning.
And it's all going to be all right,
Yeah, we've all been in a stew for the last fortnight. I don't know about you. We just don't know where they're coming or going.
Because none of us have lived through a war. It's our generation, the entire generation hasn't lived through a war. And I know personally I can't appreciate what's going to happen until, well, I saw on the television the other day, I thought, oh, bombs, you know, just guns, so they can't get too damaged. And I saw a missile, and it literally went into the centre of the ship and just blew the whole lot up, and that scared me. I thought if one of those hit his ship, he wouldn't stand a chance. And that is what scares me, really gets me knotted up inside.
All I want is my husband safe and well, and I keep telling him letters for Christ's sake. look after yourself, take care. I expect he's sick of me saying to him, take care, but I am so worried and angry and frustrated and, well, I just really am with everything. My little girl, who's 6, doesn't normally fine, healthy. She just took ill. I took her to the doctor and he said she's got asthma. And I thought, this just can't, it's not real. I thought, I just can't take.
Yeah, another thing.
Another thing? But Ronnie won't know about it. He'll be sitting there thinking she's fine, Warren's fine. Because I can't tell him that. Because he's got enough on his plate without although it isn't petty, but what he has to lie awake, he's got to think we're all right.
I went to see something special. I know you did because I saw a lot of you there. What do you think I went to see? Do you know, Anthony?
The shipyard of Falklands.
I did. I went to see the ships leaving Portsmouth Harbour. A lot of your daddies are in the Navy, aren't they? Is anybody's daddy actually on any of those ships? All right. Which ship is your daddy on then, Ian?
The Hermes.
Your daddy's on the Hermes. Is he a sailor? What about your daddy, Joanne?
HMS Fearless.
He's on HMS Fearless. Is he a sailor?
No.
What is he?
Marine.
Your daddy's a Marine. Wasn't it your daddy who'd just come home for a holiday?
Yes.
Just as you were going to have a holiday, and he had to go back, didn't he? Yes, I remember. What about you, Kirsty?
Hermes.
Your daddy's on the Hermes as well. Have you heard from them since they left?
Yes, when I got to Isle of Wight, he sent a letter.
Did he?
Said, I love you.
How nice.
Just after 4 p.m. London time yesterday, British troops landed on South Georgia and advanced towards Grytviken. At about 6 o'clock, the commander of the Argentine forces in Grytviken surrendered, having offered only limited resistance.
I knew that just from the things that it wouldn't be helicopters involving my husband's squadron because they said that some of the ships had peeled off and gone down there, and I knew that the carriers hadn't gone down there. But hearing it, I think it was very encouraging for both my friend and I to hear that, because we thought, well, if the Argentinians now realize that we mean what we're saying, they might think again about the Falklands and say, all right, maybe we'll think about a negotiated peace now more seriously.
We don't know what's going to happen now, do we? All depends which way Argentina go. But I think, if it comes to that, we'll just have to take it step by step. If it goes off as good as it did yesterday, let's put it that way, and let's hope it does. Then we'll be all right. But if it gets any worse, worse fighting than they had yesterday, I don't want to think about that yet. Not really.
When I heard they'd gone in at South Georgia, although I could see it coming, we'd sort of worked it out, ourselves in the house, each day, sort of decided what day they might go and what they would do. And it was almost as we'd sort of thought. But it was still a horrible feeling. I thought, oh, Christ, that's the start of the fighting. Where does it end,
I'm sure the House will join me in congratulating our forces on carrying out this operation successfully and recapturing the island.
Think about it, and perhaps this prayer will help. Put your hands together. Close your eyes.
Dear God, thank you for guiding us through the night and bringing us safely to a new day. We are thinking today about all the sailors, marines, pilots and the doctors and nurses who are on board ships sailing towards the Falkland Islands, especially the daddies of some of our children in our school. We ask you to keep them all safe. We also ask you to guard and help the leaders of our country and Argentina so that their meetings will be successful. Bless all the people who live in these countries, for your name's sake. Amen. Amen.
15 hours to the full Falklands blockade. Mrs. Thatcher says the Argentines hold the key to peace. The junta is still considering the American proposals. Blackout on the Falklands as the invaders prepare for a British attack. Among the last exiles, one of the island's oldest residents. Good evening. There's still been no answer tonight from Argentina to the peace proposals put forward by the United States, and there are now only 15 hours left before Britain's prepared to shoot down any Argentine aircraft within 200 miles off the Falklands. The American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, stood by in Washington all day, but the Argentine Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendez, left the American capital for New York, either to lobby the UN or to fly back home. The White House says there's little basis for optimism. But the atmosphere in London changed noticeably today. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Nott, said the crisis was still in its diplomatic phase, and yesterday's assumption that Britain was within a day or so of launching a major assault to recapture the islands has faded. Instead, the feeling is growing that while there'll almost certainly be some kind of military action, the main British tactic will be to blockade the Falklands. In other words, the effort to negotiate a settlement won't come to a sudden halt. And it's being suggested in London and in Buenos Aires tonight that if Mr. Haig's initiative is finally rejected, then the United Nations might be brought into the process of negotiation. There was a change of atmosphere at Westminster too, as the Commons held its fourth emergency debate on the crisis. Last Tuesday's bitterness between government and opposition faded, and while Mr. Foote repeated his warning that military action could jeopardise the chances of negotiation, Mrs. Thatcher went out of her way to emphasise what she saw as the correctness of the British approach.
What incentive would there have been for the Argentine junta to give Mr. Haig's ideas more than the most cursory glance if Britain had not underpinned its search for a diplomatic settlement with the dispatch of the task force? Gentle persuasion is not going to make the Argentine government give up what it has seized by force. Mr. Speaker, our military response to the situation has been measured and controlled.
Noon tomorrow is not the end of the diplomatic line, and nor does the start of the total blockade of the Falklands necessarily mean the shooting starts then. Mrs. Thatcher and her ministers have given some clear indications today that diplomacy will continue, and in spite of the warlike noises coming from Buenos Aires, there are signs from there that the generals want to keep the diplomatic channels open. There's been no official response from the Argentines to Washington's proposals, though they're probably unacceptable. And there's been no official response from Whitehall, because the British government's attitude is that the proposals are aimed at the Argentines and that it's up to them to respond first. In other words, neither side wants to be the first to turn them down. But Whitehall's sources have been at some pains to stress that while Mrs. Thatcher is prepared to use the task force, if and when necessary, the British government will consider other diplomatic options. And while they don't say what these are, they must almost inevitably involve the United Nations. Mrs. Thatcher has no faith in that organisation's ability to achieve anything on this issue, but she finds herself in a dilemma. To acknowledge that there are other diplomatic channels available would be to take the pressure off the Argentines. But to strike hard before all channels have been tried would lose Britain much of the international support it now enjoys on the Falklands issue. And just as important, it would damage Mrs. Thatcher's increased standing amongst the electorate at home. Well, that's the thinking of her advisers. The words of one Whitehall source this afternoon were, "Don't rule out some sort of military action, but don't necessarily expect a major operation yet. The Argentines, too, seem loath to close the diplomatic door. Their Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendes, has been hanging around Washington most of the day, not doing much, but perhaps hoping for some breakthrough. This report from Martin Bell.
Mr. Costa Mendes isn't actually negotiating, but he is talking about negotiating and about rumours of an expected tilt to Britain in American policy.
No, I expect to be neutral as it has been up to now, according to the spirit of American policies and according to the treaties that America has signed. So that's my expectation.
Mr. Costa Mendes is shuttling between Washington and New York, saying very little but giving a general impression of being willing to go on negotiating. But the pace of diplomacy here is painfully slow, and the British, through their ambassador, Sir Nicholas Henderson, believe that the Argentine willingness to negotiate is more apparent than real.
The US government Hague are waiting for the Argentinian reply to their proposals, and they've been waiting for a very long time. And I can't say that I think the prognosis is at all favourable.
Do you get a sense that the Argentine government is in fact willing to negotiate?
Not seriously, no. I mean, I suppose at the last minute, last minute, they may at the brink decide, but they certainly, in my view, haven't shown a serious wish to negotiate a reasonable settlement, no.
Could it be that their foreign minister is staying here so long just to suggest a willingness to negotiate?
I think there's a lot in that. I think they don't want to give the impression that they're not negotiating or ready to negotiate. But I think they want to have the fruits of fait accompli on the island while pretending to negotiate.
Do you think there's any prospect of the American even-handedness coming to an end?
Yes. I think if the negotiations break down, and it's shown quite clearly, as it will be, that it's the fault of the Argentinians, that the British have been very forthright, I'm quite sure the Americans will make clear that that's where the trouble lies, and that they will come down on our side. But I have no right to say that, but I'm no doubt about it myself.
By all accounts, Argentina's military junta has rejected the peace plans put forward by President Reagan. They don't properly take into account the Argentine position, and there can be no acceptance of proposals which do not recognize Argentina's sovereignty over the Falkland Islands. However, there's no outright rejection of the plan just yet, and apparently Argentina remains ready to explore other possibilities of negotiation in the hope of a peaceful solution, even at this late hour. The point of no return, according to one minister, has not yet been reached. However, there's little room left in which the Argentine foreign minister can maneuver. He's answerable to the military junta, and there's no sign of the hard line being softened. Even the president, General Galtieri, who's anxious for a negotiated settlement, is liable to be overruled if any weakness is shown now in the junta's seemingly inflexible stance about sovereignty over the Falkland Islands.
It's still hard to find anyone in Whitehall who can see a peaceful way out of this crisis. The Argentines are standing firm on the key issues of sovereignty and of no self-determination for the islanders, and it's really not possible to see a way of breaking that impasse. But the enormity of a battle involving the British task force and the forces of Argentina is perhaps making people think that little bit harder. The imminence of war seems to be concentrating minds wonderfully.
And in the Commons, Mrs. Thatcher said it would be highly dangerous to use the task force as a bluff to get the Argentines to withdraw. But at the same time, she didn't appear to rule out last-minute negotiations on Mr. Hague's proposals, although insisting that Argentina must reply to them first. The debate, the fourth since the Falklands crisis began, is still going on. Reporting from Westminster, Christopher Jones.
Mrs. Thatcher wavered not one jot in her tough attitude about using force if necessary, no bluffing over that task force. But there was no immediate sense of action in her speech either. Always the willingness to talk, but keeping up the pressure on the Argentines. Gentle persuasion wouldn't make them give up what they'd taken by force. Mrs. Thatcher went out of her way to explain to Mr. Foote, after the tension caused by his demand last Tuesday to go to the United Nations, to explain to him the very limited scope that the UN had got. But a placatory bow towards those demands. The Foreign Secretary would be ready to go to the UN straight away if he thought it would help. But it was Argentina that's breaking the UN order to get out of the Falklands.
Since that mandatory instruction, the government of Argentina have made no move to comply. On the contrary, they have poured in additional troops and equipment. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt where the intransigence lies in this matter. The key to peace is in the hands of the Argentine government, and the responsibility is theirs.
Yeah. Mr. Foote, for much of his speech, seemed anxious to get back to that unity that has marked the Commons' discussions until quite recently, and he was careful to repeat his support for sending that task force. But he also repeated and underlined his demand to go to the United Nations if the Hague mission failed. To the considerable glee of Labour, he quoted the latest remarks by the Admiral of the task force. Mrs. Thatcher had earlier called those remarks vivid and various. Those remarks that even now there was time for a diplomatic solution.
What the Right Honourable Lady ought to do is to take proper note, both of the warnings from our Admiral and of the invitations from the Secretary-General of the United Nations and from the opinion of growing numbers, I believe, throughout the country. The paramount interest of our country and most other countries throughout the world is that we should have a peaceful settlement of this dispute. I say we have to try again to secure that peaceful settlement. Yeah.
But the former Labour Prime Minister, Mr. Callaghan, gave not much more than a polite nod towards Mr. Foote's demands and considerable support for Mrs. Thatcher. A frontal assault on the island would mean heavy loss of life, he said, so he strongly pressed for a blockade.
It seems to me that what we have to do is to be ready to settle into a long blockade that may last, if necessary, for months, to undermine the morale of the garrison on those islands by all possible means of harassment. We should prevent them being reinforced. We should make them realize that they are beset, they are beleaguered, they have no hope of rescue and no hope of return.
Then Mr. Tony Benn, in a speech that enraged the Conservatives, an apologist for the junta, one called him, claiming that the government had lost control of the service chiefs. Mrs. Thatcher, said Mr. Benn, to roars of anger from Conservatives, was a prisoner of her own policy and a spectator of the tragedy that she was imposing on the country.
Christopher Jones reporting on tonight's Falklands debate in the Commons. But if the talking and the diplomacy fail, what are the military options open to both Britain and Argentina? Here's our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
Britain has three military options. She can either make an immediate and limited landing in the West Falklands, wait for the total air and sea blockade to take its effect, or build up for a full-scale invasion. An immediate token landing somewhere in West Falkland, for example here in the Weddell settlement, or up here in Byron Sound, would have the double advantage of planting the Union flag back in the Falkland soil and give the troops a chance to stretch their legs ashore. At the same time, the air blockade would knock out Argentine supply helicopters and auxiliary ships and whittle down their reserves of food and fuel. Then there's a third option. In 3 weeks' time, the rest of the troop ships will have reached the islands, and the task force will be better prepared for the invasion of East Falkland. The key factor in landing now is the weather. Right now it's bad and getting worse all the time. So the ships need to find shelter from waves which can engulf small ships, and seasick troops need time to recover ashore. The timing of any landing will be decided by the advance parties of SAS and SBS men who are already thought to be on the islands. It's believed that both the Special Air Service and Special Boat Squadron have landed several four-man teams on the islands, either parachuted into lonely bays from high-flying task force helicopters or landed from submarines. Either way, the men like these members of the SAS use inflatable craft which even have their own outboard motors in waterproof wrappings. The swimmers then go ashore to set up observation points and radio contact and await the arrival of the main force. Argentine troops have been combing the shoreline, searching for the beach survey and observation teams, but there are literally hundreds of miles of coastline to watch, and finding them won't be easy. So the military advice which is on Mrs. Thatcher's desk is this: grab part of the West Falklands now, give the total blockade time to take its effect, bring the rest of the task force south and assemble the whole force in the West Falklands. And that advice gives the diplomats more time for talking, but keeps up the military pressure. So much for British options. What about Argentine plans? Well, President Galtieri is being urged by some hawks on his planning staff to attack the British now. He could do it by launching a combined sea and air strike against the task force to the east of the Falklands. Now, if one of his submarines crippled a British carrier, it could alter the entire balance of power. And the Argentine Air Force has a substantial number of combat aircraft which could be used for a preemptive strike. Alternatively, he could move his fleet northeast to try to put a wedge between the carrier group and the troop ships. If President Galtieri does decide to try a naval move, his key ship will be the carrier Vienticinco de Mayo, because she's the only possible way of providing air cover. But the risks involved are so great that most observers doubt whether the Argentine Navy would want to attempt such an operation. So Argentina's real military options are strictly limited. The Army of Occupation is about to become an army under siege, and there's now less than 15 hours to go before that siege begins. The deadline has now concentrated minds in Argentina.
With the British task force about to impose a total blockade, Argentina has dramatically stepped up its airlift to the islands. Hundreds more troops have been flown in to beat tomorrow's blockade and further strengthen the Argentine defences. There are now well over 10,000 troops well dug in and ready to repel any British assault to try and seize back the Falklands. Port Stanley's tiny airport, where the Argentine flag now flies over a huge military base, is a key target. Britain has warned that from tomorrow, any aircraft on the ground in the Falkland Islands will be regarded as supporting the illegal occupation and liable to attack. But so far, no attempt has been made by the Argentine Air Force to withdraw their warplanes, or even to camouflage them. Argentine military chiefs do, however, fear that British forces will launch a sea and air assault within the next 24 hours. The main problem has been stockpiling sufficient supplies of arms and ammunition before the vital air bridge is threatened. Hercules transport planes have been shuttling between the mainland and the islands, over 100 flights a day. But if they continue tomorrow, any Argentine planes, military or civil, risk being shot down. General Menendez, the island's military governor, warns of a massacre if British troops do try to storm the island. But with Britain's total blockade about to begin, what alarms military chiefs, perhaps most of all, are food supplies for the thousands of Argentine soldiers. They know only too well that a hungry army soon becomes a demoralized army, and Argentina's troops are determined not to be starved into submission. But for the 1,800 British inhabitants, food supplies are dwindling fast. The shelves at the local supermarket are now almost bare, and the islanders are not able to share any of the tons of provisions which have been flown in for the Argentine forces. Most of the goods on sale came from Britain, either by cargo boat or aboard the Royal Navy's ice ship Endurance. But there have been no supplies delivered since before the invasion at the beginning of the month. The situation has now become desperate. Some tinned foods have run out altogether, while other vital stocks like sugar and flour have had to be rationed. But the islanders are at the moment managing to survive, often sharing supplies of food in the hope that more will somehow be delivered soon. But that could be a forlorn hope in the event of a long, drawn-out blockade. The streets of Port Stanley, the capital now renamed Puerto Argentino, are practically deserted, apart from the regular patrols as the threat of a British attack grows. The islanders are forbidden to go even shopping without special permission. For them, it is a tense, worrying time. They both welcome and fear what will happen if the British forces do try to retake the islands. And their only sources of information about what's going on are broadcasts on the BBC World Service, though many can no longer even listen to the news from London since their shortwave radios have been confiscated. Port Stanley has been transformed into a seemingly impregnable fortress, and all the frightened residents trapped here know that there'll be a major battle if British troops are to successfully recapture the Falkland Islands.
And Argentina has imposed new restrictions on the people living on the Falklands. They include a 12-hour blackout and curfew. The restrictions were announced in a broadcast by the military authorities over the local radio station, now called Radio Malvinas.
Starting today and until new orders are issued, it will be necessary to introduce the blackout system during the hours of darkness. These hours will be judged by the recognized lighting up times, which are 7:09 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. This order applies to the whole of the Malvinas Islands. Starting yesterday, A curfew is imposed between 6 p.m. and 6:30 a.m. for the whole of the population. During this period of time, persons needing to journey by foot or otherwise for a matter of urgency should call the police station, telephone 95.
Another group of people has arrived in Britain from the Falkland Islands, saying that the morale of those they've left behind has lifted since the retaking of South Georgia. They included the eldest to have left so far, Mr. Archie Short. He's 84. He was among 16 people who landed at London's Heathrow Airport, having travelled from Buenos Aires on a flight through Geneva. Another member of the party was asked about the prospects for a British assault.
I think they're very good.
Are these three Argentine troops the sort of troops you think who could withstand a British attack on the island?
I don't think they can, no. I think they're very confident. We are. I think from the information we've been able to get back today is going to be very, very useful.
How have they been behaving to you, the Argentine soldiers?
Up to very recently, not too bad, but this last few days since South Georgia fell, the attitudes have changed quite dramatically.
Tell us about that. How?
Anyway, I wouldn't like to say any more. I think I've said.
Are they short of food?
Well, food is coming in quite well now. The last few days there's been quite a lot of food.
They were killing people's pets.
But initially they were, yes.
They were killing people's
We've lost
pets.
400 sheep on the Camber because they're short of food. But other than that, anyway, I don't like to say any more. I think I've said enough.
What about the morale of the Falklanders themselves?
Very good indeed. Everybody's, as I say, everybody's very calm and cool and keeping the spirits up, and they're very good. Particularly since Sunday, since we heard about South Georgia, it's really lifted the morale, and everybody is feeling really good, you know.
What about fears of civilian casualties if there is a fight?
Well, we've got good civil defence there. We've got it fairly well organised, and we're fairly confident that if there is a problem, we'll know how to deal with it.
The Swedish government has asked Britain to see if it's possible to question the man who was in charge of the Argentines on South Georgia, Captain Alfredo Astiz. He's said to have been the leader of an army death squad in Buenos Aires, and 5 years ago, witnesses say, he shot a Swedish girl. She was last seen a year later in a military prison in Argentina. And a final note on the Falklands story, special radio programmes for the troops of the task force in the South Atlantic have been started by the British Forces Broadcasting Service. 3 times a week there's a record request programme with messages from friends and relatives at home, presented by the radio and television personality Sarah Kennedy. Francis Coverdale went to the London headquarters of Services Broadcasting to see one programme in recording.
This is BFBS, calling the United Kingdom Task Force.
Since they decided to launch the task force specials, BFBS have had more than 2,000 requests. They can only cope with 3 programmes a week and 50 requests per programme, so DJ Sarah Kennedy and the rest of the staff have quite a problem picking out the messages that'll be heard by the fleet.
She says, I haven't seen him since last November, Sarah, when his ship was deployed to the Middle East and he was on his way home when this crisis blew up. That's the joys of service life. And you haven't even seen your little boy, Graham, your little boy James. He was born on 9th of December, 81, but you do have loads of photographs. Get home as soon as you can.
The programmes are taped, then broadcast via a relay station in the South Atlantic. But unlike the propaganda being put out by the Argentine woman Liberty, these are simple, loving messages from home.
Yes, it's the usual fodder of any forces request programme. Because, I mean, that's the reason for BFBS being here, really, to maintain a link with home. And they know that we haven't got time to read out all sorts of things, messages from Granny. So it's miss you, love you, come home soon, keep your head down. I think that's the one common phrase in all of them.
The programme being recorded today will be broadcast to the fleet on Saturday. But with such a backlog of requests, BFBS are now planning to tape further programmes and send them direct to the task force ships.
And now the rest of the news. The National Union of Railwaymen is threatening a national rail strike in an attempt to save the jobs of its members at railway workshops. British Rail is proposing to get rid of 5,000 jobs.
There you are. A simple tale of everyday American folk. Well, I'm only pleased you're still watching BBC, and I hope you'll be doing that very thing at 20 to 11 on Tuesday night. Nice and early. I'll have all sorts of things to entertain you, like star names and films and probing interviews. Let me try one star name on you. Bruce Forsyth. Thought you wouldn't know it. Still, do stay up until 20 to 11 on Tuesday, won't you? Oh, very well. Please yourself.
In 25 minutes at about 10:55, there'll be highlights from today's soccer between Ipswich Town and Middlesbrough and Liverpool and Nottingham Forest when Jimmy Hill introduces Match of the Day. Now, an extended bulletin of news with John Humphreys. The time just after 10:30.
Target the Falklands, first a V-bomber, then the Harriers, and our man on the Hermes watched them go in.
I counted them all out, and I counted them all back. Their pilots were unhurt, cheerful and jubilant, giving thumbs-up signs.
And the Defence Ministry's verdict?
Both operations were successful.
Good evening. More than 4 weeks after Argentina invaded the Falklands, the British have hit back. They did it with a bomber so old it was about to be pensioned off, and jump jets never before used in war. Their targets, 2 airfields on the Falkland Islands. Their objective, to prevent the Argentines resupplying and reinforcing their garrison on the islands, and it's believed to prepare the way for British Marines to recapture the Falklands. The operation was a success, they say. The airfields were hit. At Stanley Airport, the runway was severely cratered, and Argentine planes on the ground were destroyed. Throughout the day, the Argentines have been claiming that they shot down 2 Sea Harriers and captured a pilot, and that they launched a counterattack against the task force. All that's been denied by the Ministry of Defence and by our reporter with the task force. The only damage, 1 bullet hole in the tail fin of a Harrier, and that's been repaired already. According to the official Argentine news agency, the commander of the task force called on the Argentines to surrender. They replied, "By no means, we are winning. Bring your little prince and come and get us." A reference there to Prince Andrew, who's serving on the Invincible. And we're just getting confirmed reports that British Harriers have shot down 2 Argentine Mirages within the total exclusion zone. 2 Mirages had apparently attacked the task force and the Harriers went up to engage them. The first news of the bombing raids on the Falklands came from the Ministry of Defence in London, and here's what they had to say.
I can now confirm that runways and aircraft on the ground were hit. In particular, the runway at Port Stanley was severely cratered. A full damage assessment is still awaited. All our aircraft and personnel returned safely. And now I wonder if I could refer to statements that I've seen on various tapes that Argentine planes have launched offensive operations against British ships. I think I can only say we have no reports of such an engagement.
The task force was just 90 miles off the Falkland Islands when the Sea Harriers were launched against the airfields. One of the pilots who took part in the raid on Stanley Airport said tonight it was like fireworks night. They were just hosing the anti-aircraft fire into the sky. But when we got there, the Vulcan had done its work. There were fires and smoke in the air. Argentine morale must be at an all-time low. On board HMS Hermes, the flagship of the fleet, was our reporter Brian Hanrahan. And just over an hour ago, he sent us this dispatch.
The Naval Task Force entered the exclusion zone around the Falklands at 7 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time this morning. That's 8 o'clock London time. Within an hour, the airstrike began. Our radar tracked a Vulcan bomber in to shed its load of 21,000-pound bombs across Stanley Airport. The night was ideal for surprise. Dark and overcast, no moon, just an occasional star breaking through the clouds. As the big bomber turned back to home, we monitored its radio code word. The mission was successful. A few hours after the Vulcan attack, it was Hermes' turn. At dawn, our Sea Harriers took off, each carrying 3 1,000-pound bombs. They wheeled in the sky before heading for the islands, at that stage just 90 miles away. Some of the planes went to create more havoc at Stanley, the others to a small airstrip called Goose Green near Darwin, 120 miles to the west. There they found and bombed a number of grounded aircraft mixed in with decoys. At Stanley, the planes went in low, in waves just seconds apart. They glimpsed the bomb craters left by the Vulcan and left behind them more fire and destruction. The pilots said there'd been smoke and dust everywhere, punctuated by the flash of explosions. They'd faced a barrage of return fire, heavy but apparently ineffective. I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out and I counted them all back. Their pilots were unhurt, cheerful and jubilant, giving thumbs-up signs. One plane had a single bullet hole through the tail. It's already been repaired. After studying the reconnaissance photographs, the Admiral's staff pronounced both raids a success, with aircraft damaged and airfields cratered. The intention of the attack was threefold: to damage radar and missiles that could threaten the Harrier's activities, to deny Stanley as a base to Argentine aircraft, and to cut off the Falklands by air, enforcing Britain's blockade. The bombing pattern was designed to strike only at the airport, not at the town, which is several miles away. There were intended to be no civilian casualties. Since the airstrike, there's been a continuous probing of our defenses by Argentine aircraft. It's been long-range warfare with little sign of it here on Hermes, just the flickers on the radar screens and the regular patrolling of the Harriers above. They go out to meet each new threat, but so far, all the enemy planes have turned away without fighting. They've stayed well clear of the task force. Admiral Woodward, the task force commander, is celebrating his 50th birthday today. He told the pilots before they left, "The best birthday present you can give me is to all come back. But there's no point in your going at all unless you do a good job." At the end of the day, the Admiral said, "We didn't want this fight. I'd hoped we could put it off. But we've shown our colours, and it's been our day." Brian Hanrahan, BBC, aboard HMS Hermes, off the Falkland Islands.
Brian Hanrahan.
In Buenos Aires, 3 members of a British ITV crew who were abducted have been found safe after 5 hours. They'd been dragged out of their own car into another by men in plain clothes, who it's thought were armed. They were later found naked by the roadside about 30 miles outside the capital. The Argentine Interior Minister says he'll invite them all out to dinner. Now, other news. In Northern Ireland, 2 men have been killed in separate shooting incidents. One was a former Ulster Defence Regiment member shot dead in Strabane. The Pope has arrived in Portugal for a 4-day visit. Tomorrow, a year after the attempt on his life, he'll visit the Shrine of Fatima to offer thanks for his recovery. If there are any more developments, we'll of course bring them to you here on BBC One, and we'll be back with a special bulletin at 10 to 9 in the morning. It'll include a film report from Brian Hanrahan with the task force, which he sent off as the force sailed south and before it had arrived off the Falkland Islands. Good night.
Now on BBC One, a programme change. On the day the Queen Elizabeth II sailed for the Falklands, BBC South reporter Tim Hurst now traces her conversion from luxury liner into troopship par excellence.
On May the 3rd, Bank Holiday Monday, the QE2 was only hours from her home port of Southampton when her master was informed that the great liner had been requisitioned for service with the task force as a troop carrier. According to the Ministry of Defence, the QE2 had unique qualities which were necessary as a backup to the ships which had already sailed to the South Atlantic. For the first time in her 15-year history, the flagship of the British merchant fleet was to go into military service. As her passengers stepped ashore next morning, they were leaving government property. The QE2 was under orders of the Ministry of Defence.
I was a little surprised, and I'm disappointed for the future people who are going to enjoy the cruise. But of course, if it's necessary, it's necessary.
It was very sad for all the staff. We felt sorry for them.
Well, I was somewhat expecting that because already in New York I suspected that, so I take more insurance.
You took more insurance?
Yeah. And I wish you the best in the war.
I hope to go kick the hell out of those guys. Anticipate that possibility.
On board the QE2, meetings were already in progress between Cunard directors and MOD officials to decide how to modify the liner for service as a troopship. Recreational equipment was being brought ashore as other supplies were being taken on board. It was already known that there was space to accommodate heavy helicopters, and it seemed likely that helicopter pads would be constructed at the stern of the ship. This would mean major structural alterations to the sides of the ship. The liner should have been preparing for a 12-day Mediterranean cruise with 1,800 passengers and a crew of 900. Instead, preparations were in hand for the billeting of thousands of servicemen. According to Cunard, intensive use of the 1,000 cabins and recreation rooms could provide accommodation for as many as 15,000 men if that's what the ministry wanted. Alongside a show of patriotism from a generation of young Britons for whom, until now, war had existed only in the history books. History as the world's most prestigious passenger liner started on the slipway at Clydebank in 1967. She'd cost £29.5 million, and her vital statistics were impressive. A cruising speed of 28.5 knots and destined to carry 2,800 passengers and crew in luxury. She was luckier than the first Queen Elizabeth.
British forces have now established a firm bridgehead on the Falkland Islands. Royal Marine Commandos and the Parachute Regiment are now ashore in substantial numbers with artillery, air defence weapons and other heavy equipment already disembarked from our ships. These landings were unopposed.
Good evening. The Defence Secretary has just said that British forces are back in what he called a firm bridgehead in the Falkland Islands and have got anti-aircraft missiles ashore to defend it. And in other fighting there, some Argentine prisoners have been taken and other British forces are staying on shore elsewhere in the islands. Mr. Knott said that Argentine air attacks had damaged 5 British ships, 2 of them seriously, and he said there will have been British casualties. Argentina claims a British frigate is on fire. Mr. Knott said Argentina had lost 7 Mirage aircraft, 5 Skyhawks, 2 Pucara ground attack planes and 2 helicopters. He said the British forces had lost 2 small helicopters. Here's Mr. Knott's statement.
Following the raids which we announced earlier today, British forces have now established a firm bridgehead on the Falkland Islands. Royal Marine Commandos and the Parachute Regiment are now ashore in substantial numbers with artillery, air defence weapons and other heavy equipment already disembarked from our ships. These landings were unopposed. A secure land base is being consolidated. During the night, several landings and raids were made by our forces in different parts of the Falkland Islands. Some of these forces have remained ashore. Argentine forces have suffered casualties and some prisoners have been taken. These operations continue. As we expected, our ships have come under heavy air attack. 5 have been damaged, 2 seriously. There will have been British casualties, but we have no details. Our Harriers and missiles have destroyed 7 Mirage, 5 Skyhawks and 2 Pucaras. 2 Argentine helicopters, a Chinook and a Puma, have been destroyed on the ground. We have lost 2 of our small helicopters. 7 weeks after the Argentine aggression, British forces are tonight firmly established back on the Falkland Islands.
We expect a report from our correspondent with the task force, Michael Nicholson, shortly. The Prime Minister got back to Downing Street tonight after having lived with the Falkland Islands crisis for 7 weeks since Argentina invaded. She told Ray Maloney these were nervous days, but
we've got marvellous fighting forces. Everyone's behind them. They're fighting a just cause. We wish them Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
We've the most marvellous fighting forces in the world. They're courageous, they're dedicated,
They're fighting a just cause, and everyone's behind them. Indeed, I think not only in this country, but in so many countries elsewhere.
Is it going
Thank
the
you,
way we
gentlemen.
hoped
Good
it
night.
would now?
The leader of the opposition, Mr. Michael Foot, is here. His views on the fighting and the crisis in a moment. British forces appear to have gone ashore by both helicopter and assault craft. Since the main landing was unopposed, they will have had most of the day to get missiles and other equipment ashore to deal with Argentine attacks. Here's our defence correspondent, Geoffrey Archer.
Senior government ministers have been cautioning against expecting a full-scale British invasion of the Falklands, but establishing a firm bridgehead, as Mr. Nott put it, sounds like the first step of just such an invasion. It's thought that about 1,000 Royal Marines and paratroops have been in action today, assisted by special forces. Mr. Nott said the main landing was unopposed, but that was only at the start. A suitable beach was found where the assault ships Fearless and Intrepid could launch their landing craft to put ashore the substantial numbers of Royal Marines and paratroops Mr. Nott referred to. Much of the landing may have been carried out by helicopter. To defend the bridgehead that Britain has established, the Defence Secretary said artillery and air defence weapons were landed too, probably the highly effective Rapier anti-aircraft missile system. The troops will also be armed with the blowpipe handheld anti-aircraft missile. Scorpion light tanks are believed to have been put ashore too. They will be valuable in fighting off any attempts by Argentine forces to attack the British bridgehead with their armoured vehicles. This main landing seems to have been at San Carlos in the northwest corner of the East Island. The British ships came up the narrow sound leading to the settlement, and it's thought that it was here that Argentine jets made attack after attack on the ships and damaged 5 of them. A destroyer and a frigate are seriously damaged, though the ships' names are not known, but it appears the 2 aircraft carriers were not hit. The Argentine Air Force launched their major assault on the British task force when the ships drew close to the islands for the landings. They were well within range of the mainland-based Mirage and Skyhawk aircraft. There appears to have been a massive air battle with the British Harriers. The British Defence Ministry say that 14 Argentine fighters and bombers were shot down by missiles and Harriers, but there is no confirmation that all the Harriers survived. The toll of damage seems to be like this. 5 British ships were damaged, 2 seriously. 2 small British helicopters were lost, and there are unconfirmed reports that 2 Harriers may have been shot down. Argentina lost 7 of her Mirage-type jets, 5 of her Skyhawk bombers, and 2 Pucara ground attack planes. A Chinook and a Puma troop-carrying helicopter were destroyed on the ground. With such an intense battle, there may be considerable numbers of casualties on both sides. But it appears the British forces have a firm footing on the islands, and the task force commander's plan for repossession of the Falklands is well on its way to fruition.
Earlier today, the Ministry of Defence announced that 21 soldiers were missing, presumed dead after a Navy-seeking helicopter ditched into the sea. They were being transferred from their ships for the assault on the islands. It's not known when it happened. The Ministry of Defence say 30 men were on the helicopter. 9 were rescued. 1 body was picked up. Next of kin have been informed. It's the 7th helicopter the task force has lost through accidents. In Buenos Aires, the junta have made other claims of British losses, but they haven't given any details of Argentine losses. Speaking to a Buenos Aires radio station, the military chaplain with the troops on the islands urged his countrymen to pray for victory and added, "We're having some problems." Ken Rees, who's in Buenos Aires, has the latest details.
Today's invasion is being viewed here as the first major test between Britain's highly sophisticated Royal Naval Task Force and the Argentine fighter planes. Their official communiques say that the 2 British warships, which the Defence Ministry say were seriously damaged, have in fact been sunk. They claim that the 2 ships are a Type 42, similar to HMS Sheffield, and a Type 22 destroyer, which is in fact a broadsword-type frigate. One of the vessels is said to have been hit by a 1,000-pound bomb. Argentine authorities say that another British frigate is listing and 2 other unidentified warships are damaged. During the assault, they say that 2 landing craft were sunk and claim that British troops who are on the islands are now being surrounded by troops and tanks. They admit the action today has been fierce, yet they say that they've only lost 3 aircraft, 1 Dagger-type plane which ran out of fuel, and 2 helicopters on the ground. This morning, as first news of the British invasion reached the streets here, most people found it hard to believe.
I don't think that they would be able to take the Malvinas because they are ours.
Do you accept...
And we will defend it till the very end.
Do you accept you could lose this war?
No. Of course not. Since the very beginning, we know we are winning the war.
Many people here simply can't accept the idea of successful British military action against the Falklands. They've been told that the islands are an impregnable fortress and that their men will give their last drop of blood to keep the British from landing. The communiques which people do receive invariably take an optimistic note. They always talk of the enemy forces being repulsed by the action of the Argentines. So the mood in the city still remains calm. The conflict is thousands of miles away, and people simply don't feel that it affects them directly. There's plenty of national fervour here, but so far it's cost them little personally. It remains to be seen what will happen if Argentina suffers major casualties on the Falklands, because then the mood here in the capital could change very rapidly. Ken Rees, News at 10, Buenos Aires.
The Ministry of Defence in London has refused to comment on the Argentine claims. The ministry say it'll be several hours before they have any information about casualties, and they emphasise that next of kin will be informed as soon as possible. They've issued a list of telephone numbers for relatives to call, and they are, for Rosyth, 0383 412191, Faslane 0436 71125, Plymouth 0752 666666, Portland 0305 821 547, Portsmouth 0705 755 212, Chatham 0634 812 771, and for the Royal Marines at Plymouth 0752 66 7777.
In America, a White House statement repeated today that the United States would meet its commitments to Britain, but emphasized there would be no involvement of U.S. military personnel. In Washington, the British ambassador, Sir Nicholas Henderson, had talks with Mr. Hague and said afterwards the Secretary of State's role would still be the vital one. From Washington, John Suchet.
Britain has been keeping the United States fully informed of developments, and after this meeting, Sir Nicholas made it clear that the United States was prepared to mediate again.
We have not discussed, the United States is not involved in any new peace initiative, but I know that they are always ready, and the Secretary of Hague will always be ready, if the moment comes, to play an important, not to say decisive part.
Ready to play a decisive part, but not yet about to do so. In fact, it's been some days since either President Reagan or Mr. Hague made any public statement on the Falkland Islands dispute. And the reason for that is that the United States believes that she alone has the power and authority to solve this dispute diplomatically. Even Argentina recognizes that. And so Mr. Hague's mediation efforts may at the moment be in a pause, but they are not dead. John Suchet, News at 10 in Washington.
The United Nations Secretary-General, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, told an emergency session of the Security Council tonight that the collapse of the peace talks could mean all-out war. He said, "The prospect which faces us is one of destruction, continuing conflict, and above all the loss of many, many lives." The Security Council is in session on the Falklands tonight. Argentina's Foreign Minister, Mr. Costa Mendes, is said to be hurrying back to New York tonight from Buenos Aires. Britain's United Nations ambassador has made it plain that Britain will veto any Security Council call for a ceasefire. Sir Anthony Parsons said that would tie British hands and leave Argentina to consolidate what it has acquired by force. Trevor MacDonald.
A full meeting of the Security Council became inevitable once the Secretary-General faced squarely the failure of his peace attempt.
Well, it is nice to see you all, but the ball is no longer in my court.
America's ambassador to the UN, Mrs. Jean Kirkpatrick, made this comment about today's meeting.
Well, I had a question about whether there might be more effective fact-finding in a preliminary meeting, which both parties would be present, but with less formal procedures.
That was not accepted.
Well, the Argentines were not enthusiastic about it, let's put it that way. No, the Argentines rejected it, but let's be very clear that the United States did not in any sense oppose a public meeting, not at all. The question was only whether there would be another meeting in addition to it.
The manner in which this Security Council meeting happened tells us a great deal about what its outcome is likely to be. This is what happened. As we have just heard, at this morning's informal session, America's UN ambassador, Mrs. Kirkpatrick, floated the idea of another larger informal meeting to which Argentina would be invited and at which a sober, private, unpolemical assessment would be made of the Falklands crisis. There's a precedent for this. It happened in 1975, when the crisis in the Western Sahara was discussed in this way. But Argentina disagreed, no doubt, so that Senor Ross could have his say in public, as he has had this evening. And there'll be a lot more rhetoric before the evening's out. But what then? Well, the debate will undoubtedly end with an attempt to pass a resolution condemning what's going on in the South Atlantic. Since the British Naval Task Force is now engaged in the fighting there, whatever resolution is framed will name Britain, and not just Argentina, as aggressors now. Britain will veto such a resolution. America might well abstain, and there'll be no unanimity in the Council. So, while another world crisis simmers ominously, the United Nations, charged with trying to preserve world peace, will make angry noises, but in effect will be doing nothing. Trevor MacDonald, News at 10, New York.
The Labour Party's leader, Mr. Michael Foot, is here in the studio. He'll give his thoughts on today's news coming in a couple of minutes. Direct from the fighting in the Falklands, a report by our correspondent there, Michael Nicholson, who was there when one of today's raids took place. Here's his report.
Tonight, the Union Jack flies again on the Falkland Islands. They did it by moonlight, silently and successfully. They landed in their thousands. The first landing craft hit the beaches a little after 6:30 local time, that's 9:30 British time, and with black faces, heavily camouflaged, carrying enormous packs with mortars, rifles, machine guns, anti-tank rockets. All this strapped to their backs, they clambered down the rope netting at the side of the mother ship into their landing craft, they were queuing up alongside these ships like taxis. The men were cheerful, they were patient, because they had to wait for a place, drinking mugs of tea and hot cocoa on the deck. One of the company officers told me, just before he clambered down the net, that their first objective was to establish a bridgehead on high ground for the rest of the landing force to follow.
We're going ashore. We're going to land on the beach in landing craft. We're going to clear the immediate area and establish a beachhead. Then I'm going to move up onto the high ground and establish defensive positions on a reverse slope.
Are you expecting any resistance?
Indications at the moment are that resistance will be very light at this particular spot.
It's a clear moonlight night. Is it the kind of condition you'd hope for or not?
No, I would prefer, obviously, more cloud and less moon, but tonight's the night and we're going. Good luck to you. Thank you very much.
The operation from the first man to the last man ashore took just over 4 hours. The last landing craft left us. It was just beginning to get light, and we could hear naval bombardment on the high ground just beyond us, which was a known Argentinian troop position. In less than 15 minutes, they bombarded that position with over 60 shells. They've established their beachheads. We can see them quite clearly. One of them is only about a mile away, around a cluster of houses. We can see the light tanks. We can see the Scorpions. They're setting up their air defenses. We can see the helicopter pads, tents. They're all established. Already we know that they had unopposed landings, at least in all but one of them. We could hear some firefighting as we passed in our ship at the beginning of a sound. At one of the unopposed landings near a small village, really just a cluster of white stone buildings, troops found 31 Falklanders in their own kind of makeshift shelter, including 14 children there. They're all safe and they're all uninjured. Only one thing could have hampered things. That was the weather. The task force commanders, the Navy and amphibious, had wanted low cloud, bad visibility to give their men cover from the Argentinian shore batteries and from the air. But after yesterday's fog and force 9 gale, the dawn this very cold morning was crystal clear with a brilliant sun. So the men ashore, like those of us in the ships close inshore, had to wait for the promised and expected Argentinian air attacks, and we didn't have to wait long. We could see the troops fanning across the open moorlands. It looks a little like Scotland, crouching, sometimes running, then crouching again, running from one hillock and one protective mound to the next. Flocks of sheep scampered away from them. We could also see the Scorpion light tanks moving ahead of the infantry, and minutes ago I watched as they spread out in line behind the tanks, moving towards a number of houses, 10, maybe 12 houses and farmyards, and we saw earlier on some smoke coming from one of those buildings, so perhaps there was some fire, but the wind was blowing away from us, so we couldn't hear if it was gunfire or not. There are about us 20 ships or more in this long, narrow stretch of water. It's a kind of fjord, I suppose that's how you'd describe it, that comes off the Falklands Sound. It divides the two islands, east and west. I can see them all, and beside the warships of the task force are other ships, civilian ships that have come to join us. The helicopters are flying between the ships and between the ships and the troops, taking ashore supplies of food, ammunition, water. Water is going to be one of the big problems. The landing craft are also taking stores ashore, and I gather that some of the craft are being used as minesweepers. At a little after 10 o'clock here, that's 1 o'clock London time, with the sun still low and very dazzling, the Argentinians began their air attack, and we went into what turned out to be a day-long action station's red air alert. First, it was the Picaras, the short takeoff and landing aircraft that may have come from the islands. They possibly are still using grass strips on the islands. They attacked us with cannon fire and rockets. Almost certainly one of them was hit because the captain of our ship thought he saw a parachute dropping into the sea. What's also possible is these Picaras were being used for reconnaissance, to sass us out, to find out whether this was in fact a full-scale landing or whether it was, as the Argentinians first broadcast, just a series of small commando raids. But once we'd been established, once the number of ships had been seen and the number of troops had been seen, there was no hiding the message. We were here to stay. One warship fired back with missiles and hit what we thought was an A4, but the air raids continued all afternoon. This is how it sounded. Five Mirages. There are 5 Mirages coming in. Minutes later, the Argents sent in more Mirage, followed by their A4s. Bombers, fighter bombers, coming from the mainland. They came in again very low, flying from the west, crossed the Falklands Sound, and then turned into our anchorage and bombed. 2 bombs fell just ahead of us. A second fell wide and exploded on a hillside to our right. The Argentinian pilots seemed not to want to come in close enough for precision bombing, probably wary of our own missile systems aboard the ships. We could actually see the missiles chasing the aircraft, zigzagging and chasing course as the pilot, the Argentinian pilot, wildly maneuvered his plane to escape. 2 have been shot down in front of us. Others have been caught by the Harriers from HMS Invincible and Hermes on their way to or on their way from us. We gather that it's 14 aircraft down, and all that matters here tonight as we sit on our ship in the darkness now is that the Union Jack is flying less than a mile away from us, and despite the fact we're still on action stations and red alert, there'll probably be a few secret pints of beer drunk aboard this ship tonight. This is Michael Nicholson with the British Task Force, a mile away from the Falkland Islands.
Argentina has just said it accepts that Britain has established a bridgehead on the Falklands. And now the leader of the Labour Party, Mr. Michael Foot. Mr. Foot, you said if our troops are sent in, the action should be as swift and successful as possible. What do you say to tonight's news?
Well, now that first thing I think to be in all our thoughts is now that British troops are in action, our first concern must be for their safety and their success and the anxieties of their families. And as I said yesterday, if the action is to be taken, well, the more swiftly it can be accomplished, the better.
Do you feel it is the right action, that no other action was possible?
No, I don't think no other action was possible, but this, and it having been embarked upon, I think, of course, we must try and make it successful, both in the interests of the servicemen and of their protection. But to say that no other action was possible, I don't think is the case.
Well, you told the Prime Minister yesterday that she should have flown to the United Nations, but don't you think, in the light of what has happened at the United Nations, that was a bit pointless?
No, I think that the opposite, in fact, and indeed I listened very carefully to what the Secretary-General was saying, and very movingly what he said a few minutes ago about many, many lives being at stake. He said also yesterday on the radio, I heard him in the morning, as I suppose many others did, saying the price in human lives and human suffering is too high, and I think that is another aspect of the matter that has to be taken into account. So I don't think anyone should dismiss the role of the Secretary-General or of the United Nations. And the reason why I said that I thought the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary or both of them could have responded to that last appeal from the Secretary-General is because I'm quite certain that the Secretary-General is going to come back into this matter if we're going to get a solution in the end. And nobody denies, as far as I know, neither the Prime Minister nor the Minister of Defence or any of them, none of them deny that there's got to be a negotiation, and I believe that we must always, even whilst these other events are happening, we must keep our eyes on that too.
Our ambassador in Washington, Sir Nicholas Henderson, says he thinks it'll come back to the Americans and the Secretary-General, Mr. Haig. Would you agree with that?
Well, we're not trying to say anything against, and we haven't ever said in the Labour Party trying to exclude Mr. Haig from the negotiations. Of course not, because we are eager to use every influence that can bring this hideous business to an end. But I do think that the Secretary-General's role has been crucial and will be crucial, and I think that no one should neglect it. And indeed, the Prime Minister, I don't think, said anything yesterday which was derogatory of the role adopted by the Secretary-General. But I wish that she and others had made the kind of response that I was suggesting. I know that the government says, and with some justice, that they have had long negotiations, and that is true. And as I said in the House of Commons, anyone who examines those negotiations must come to the conclusion that the British government was quite prepared to make a series of compromises in the interests of getting a full settlement. I think that must be known all over the world. I want it to be known all over the world, because we are going to be dependent in some degree on the opinion of other countries. One of the other aspects of the news that is of great importance tonight, of course, is the news from the Security Council itself. And our country's position will depend to some extent on the verdict of these other countries. And so all the more important was to establish, which I think is the fact, that we did try to get a settlement, although, I repeat, I think we could have made a further last effort last night, as I suggested in the House of Commons.
Now, you say that we are dependent upon the reaction of other countries in the future of this crisis. But what do you think actually will most quickly bring influence to bear upon the government in Buenos Aires?
Well, I quite have always accepted the view that the task force had to be sent, and I believed that, if it was sent, it might at some stage be used, as it has been used. The circumstances in which it is used are matters to be judged by us and everybody, and we're entitled to continue to judge it. But I do believe that it's absurd or most unwise for people to push aside the opinion of other countries in these matters, because we will be dependent. After all, we are acting, quite properly in this sense, under the Security Council Resolution 502. That was dependent upon the votes of countries at the Security Council. The British government cannot say that it is not going to be interested in the votes of other countries at that Security Council, the Americans and other countries involved there. We cannot neglect their opinion, and indeed we are dependent on them for also the other actions that can be taken, the economic actions and the economic pressures which can be of importance. Mr. Haig himself said, when he was finishing his own discussions some week or two ago, he said there cannot in the end be a military solution of this problem. And despite what's happening there in the South Atlantic now, military operations are taking place, and as far as our servicemen are concerned, we must do everything to protect them, but it does not alter the truth of what Mr. Haig said. There cannot, in the end, be solely a military solution. There has also to be a diplomatic solution, and for that we are bound to be dependent, in some degree, on other countries too.
Well, now how do we work up to that? How would you regard that? You see, probably tonight in the Security Council, a number of countries are going to call for an immediate ceasefire. Would you say that was sensible for Britain to accept?
No, well, immediate ceasefire, if it was a ceasefire which left our servicemen in an unprotected position or left us in a position which we couldn't protect them, of course, wouldn't be a tolerable position. But there will come a time, I hope it'll come fairly soon, when we can get a ceasefire, because many, as the Secretary-General says, don't let us forget it, many, many lives are going to be lost. There will come a point when it will be advantageous for this country, as well as the rest of others concerned, to have such a resolution in the Security Council. So I think we should be careful about any suggestion of vetoing such a resolution. I think it's much better that we should try and persuade the other countries there to accept our view of the situation, as I am sure Sir Anthony Parsons is seeking to do. That is the best way to proceed. If a veto happens, then we're going to be in difficulties. We did, of course, in the Labour Party, in these discussions over these weeks, we did give warning about this aspect of the matter. We said we have to be careful that we do not put ourselves in a position where we have the Security Council taking action which is injurious to us. And we have still to be careful about that. And that warning is very relevant.
Now, do you think that Britain should go back to the terms that we understand the government agreed to last Sunday, but which Argentina then turned round? Would it in fact be right? Has this blood been spilt in vain in the South Atlantic?
I think it would be right to go back to those terms. I think it's a mistake for the government to say, and as I repeat, we have never given the government a blank cheque. We are entitled to judge the matter. And as we said in the House of Commons yesterday, we think it is a mistake for the government to say that those terms are withdrawn. Myself, I think the government will change that attitude, and I won't blame them or criticize them. I will urge them that they should be prepared to do so, because I believe that we want to bring the matter to an end as speedily as possible. That means some form of ceasefire at some stage. That means to say that the Argentine authorities, whoever they may be, must at some stage be prepared also to recommend some kind of cessation of the hostilities that they are ordering, and that can be dependent on what they think are the terms that they can get. So I don't believe it would be an intolerable position or a disgraceful position if we return to the terms which I think the British government quite rightly offered as a way of avoiding the hostilities that are now taking place.
Are you satisfied with the performance of your party? Do you not think that the behavior of some members of your party have actually encouraged the Argentine government?
No, I don't think that. I think some of the things that have been said have, not by a party, by some different people in this country, are used in the Argentine. But I believe what our party has done from the beginning, and what we continue to do and insist upon, is that we must always look for a peaceful solution of this problem. And in saying that, we are saying what has been said by every person who's looked at the whole problem. It is saying also what is said by the Secretary-General, and I come back to him because I believe that the Secretary-General's assistance and efforts, as the government itself has acknowledged, were of first-class importance. I think we should listen to what he says today. I think we should listen to what he says tomorrow. Some of the arguments will depend on the influence that he exerts. And we in the Labour Party have said right from the beginning of this controversy, indeed we went to see the Secretary-General even before the government did. If the government had been to see the Secretary-General at the beginning, I don't say it would have all been solved, I'm not saying that for a moment, but I do say that it would have been a better way of proceeding, and we have done it because we do believe that one of the central features in the whole of this terrible business is the maintenance of the authority of the United Nations Charter and the United Nations Organization, and that can be a help to us in solving this problem and saving lives, including British lives.
Yes, but a lot of people would say that the United Nations itself had done nothing to carry out its own resolution, and that when you are dealing with some people in the world, force may be the only answer.
Yes, I know, but we must be careful to say that we are acting under the United Nations authority, and it's a great mistake for anybody in this country to say that we are not doing something. We haven't the authority to act without that. Now, it is not satisfactory it is not a condemnation of the United Nations to say that they haven't carried out their own mandate, because that depends on the individual countries that are members of the Security Council.
But they're the people who are there tonight, Mr.
Yes,
Foote,
I know.
and they won't do anything to carry out that mandate, will they?
They won't do anything to carry out. They have, most of the countries, 10 out of the countries have given us considerable assistance. They voted for the Security Council 502, which is the sheet anchor of the whole of our case on this matter. We should certainly not be neglectful of what their position is, and if nothing could be more foolish for the British case than for us to deride the position of the United Nations. Their authority is going to be a powerful instrument in getting peace in the end.
One final question. Have you yet had the resignations of your 3 junior spokesmen who went against your wishes last night?
That is a very minor matter compared with the major questions that we are discussing. I'm sure what's uppermost in your mind, all our minds, is how we can save as many lives as possible, how we can get this matter through as speedily as possible, as honourably as possible, and how we can get back to what all of us have said we wanted, and we do want a peaceful settlement of the dispute.
Thank you very much. Well, now the news.
And Argentine missiles knock out the supply ship Atlantic Conveyor. 4 of her crew are dead. The Prime Minister says Britain will not be turned aside.
Despite these grievous losses, neither our resolve nor our confidence is weakened.
And the first pictures of the British task force in action in the South Atlantic. The British task force has lost 2 more ships. 24 crewmen have been killed and over 20 others injured. These latest casualties were inflicted by Argentine air attacks yesterday on a destroyer north of West Falkland and a supply ship believed to be heading for the Port San Carlos beachhead. The destroyer lost in the attack was HMS Coventry. She was hit by bombs and most of the casualties were from her crew. The container ship Atlantic Conveyor was hit by Exocet missiles, like those that sank HMS Sheffield earlier this month. She'd been carrying Harriers, but they'd been taken off before the ship was abandoned. The Prime Minister said the new losses wouldn't break the government's resolve. Britain knew the hazards of war. Mrs. Thatcher made her remarks at a conference of Conservative women in London.
Our hearts go out to all those families who had men in these ships. But despite these grievous losses, neither our resolve nor our confidence is weakened.
In the Commons, the Defence Secretary, Mr. Nott, said that our forces on the Falklands were now poised to begin their thrust on Port Stanley, despite the losses of ships and men caused by Argentine air attacks. MPs were silent as he described yesterday's attacks and the casualties suffered.
At approximately 7:30 London time, a further raid of Skyhawks approached HMS Coventry. She was hit by several bombs and suffered severe damage. She later capsized. Initial casualty figures are that 20 members of her crew died in the attack, and about 20 were injured, and the remainder of her crew of some 280 are safe on board other ships of the task force. After this attack on HMS Coventry, at about 8:30, Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant navy ship protected by escorts and employed in the resupply task, was attacked by 2 Super Étendard aircraft which fired Exocet missiles. She was hit and set on fire. She was loaded with supplies for British forces on the Falkland Islands. She had no Harriers embarked. In this attack, 4 of those on board Atlantic Conveyor were killed and a small number were injured. The remainder of those 170 who were on board are now safe on other ships.
John Nott was at pains to steady nerves in a sad and subdued house. When a setback occurred, he said there was always a danger of undue pessimism, just as success sometimes produced needless euphoria. He warned against both. Generally, the military objectives had gone exactly as ministers had planned, though we'd had losses and there might be more on land and sea. Mr. Nott was pressed by several Conservatives to take action against the Argentine mainland. He replied that this wouldn't shorten the conflict, and he implied that bombing the air bases wasn't militarily feasible. Mr Knott promised John Silken for Labour to keep every diplomatic avenue open in order to minimise casualties, but he told David Owen of the SDP that the Argentines showed no sign of wanting a peaceful settlement. Tony Benn asked how many more lives the government thought it sensible to lose before it went to the UN for a ceasefire. Mr Knott said he didn't think it sensible to lose one extra life, but the military action was to free the Falkland Islanders. The exchanges ended with an angry scene between the Speaker, George Thomas, and a Labour MP, Andrew Falls, who was ordered to leave the House for disobeying the chair. Mr Falls accused Mr Thomas of refusing to accept speakers who were opposed to what he called this lunatic operation, but the House backed the Speaker by 277 votes to 27.
The latest damage to the Coventry and Atlantic conveyor brings to 5 the number of British vessels lost or out of action. One other ship, the destroyer Broadsword, was slightly damaged in yesterday's attack, but there were no casualties. Here's our defence correspondent Christopher Wayne.
We had a good morning, they had a good afternoon. That's how one senior official at Whitehall put it today. And that good afternoon for the Argentine Air Force knocked out 2 more ships. Of the 2, the Atlantic Conveyor was the more important, for she was hit while she was on her way to the San Carlos beachhead, laden down with stores. The Atlantic Conveyor had been requisitioned from Cunard to carry RAF Harrier jets to the Falklands, and according to the Defence Ministry, all those jump jets had already been flown off. But there were thousands of tons of other stores, including some helicopters which were in crates. Again, the Defence Ministry stressed the loss of the ship won't cripple the task force. Indeed, it could have been worse. The Argentine pilots who launched the Exocets may have thought they had one of the British carriers in their sights. Given the choice, they might have preferred to hang on to those missiles. The loss of HMS Coventry was the result of an ambush by Argentine Skyhawks. They'd come from the south at low level, hidden by radar view from the landmass. As a result, the Coventry failed to detect the planes in time to use her Sea Dart missiles. Earlier in the day, she'd shot down 2 out of 4 Skyhawks coming in to bomb the beachhead. But caught as she was in open water, the Argentine pilots were able to get a clear bombing run. The battle being fought by the thin grey line of British warships trying to hold off Argentine attacks is one which requires a lot of discipline. Without that gun line, the Argentine planes would have been able to decimate the supply ships in San Carlos water. So far, the line has lost 3 warships but gained 10 reinforcements. And they won't need to hold on much longer. The bulk of the heavy stores have now been landed, and the troop reinforcements on QE2 are on their way.
The latest Argentine claims say that in yesterday's battle they damaged 3 British warships and a transport ship and shot down 3 Harriers. And they've released a photograph taken by an attacking Argentine pilot said to show a British frigate at the moment bombs hit. There's no indication which ship it was. Today, the Argentine President, General Galtieri, has been visiting bases in the south of the country and meeting representatives of the Pope. This report from Clive Ferguson.
Galtieri's morale-boosting trip to Comodoro Rivadavia in the south of the country coincided with the latest news of the loss of 2 British ships. An official communique issued while the Argentine President was in the middle of his visit claimed that both the Coventry and the Atlantic Conveyor had sunk. Earlier, Argentina claimed that Sea Harriers attacked an Argentine ship off the Falkland Islands. 1 Argentine was killed and 2 were wounded in the attack, the statement said. It also claimed that 1 Harrier had been shot down. It's not clear what Galtieri will do on this his first trip outside Buenos Aires since April. That was when he flew to the Falkland Islands. He won't be going as far south as Rio Gallegos, where these pictures were taken yesterday. The infantry there haven't seen action. They're stationed there to guard the coastline of southern Argentina, and there was no lack of determination on their faces as they paraded through the town following yesterday's National Day ceremonies. This afternoon, the President will meet the Papal Nuncio and the 2 Argentine cardinals who arrived this morning from Rome. There was great disappointment here at the announcement that the Pope was, after all, to visit Britain, the land of the aggressor, as one newspaper headline put it. So this morning, the Vatican Foreign Affairs Secretary, Archbishop Silvestrini, was at pains to point out that the Pope's visit to Britain was purely pastoral, not political, and had been planned for 2 years.
We've just received pictures from the South Atlantic of the first military action by the task force. The film was sent by satellite today from Ascension Island, where it was taken by ship.
It includes an interview with the captain of HMS Sheffield, the first task force ship to be lost 3 weeks ago. But it starts with the first air attack on the airfield at Port Stanley. Brian Hanrahan watched the action from HMS Hermes.
It's dawn on May Day. The Harriers, already laden with bombs, wait their turn to strike at Port Stanley. Over the horizon, a Vulcan bomber has used the dark to drop its bomb load on the airport. Now the early morning light will show the Harriers the way in. Their pilots have already spent hours memorizing the route, poring over maps and reconnaissance photographs taken from every angle. If the planning goes right, they'll sweep round the mountains and across the target in exactly 31 seconds. The bombs are a mixture of shrapnel and high explosive, intended to crater the runway and destroy anything and anyone near it. Some have time fuses, and they need cosseting with plastic bags. Taunts are chalked along the sides, a ritual copied from earlier wars. A slight squall delays the takeoff. Finally, a rainbow heralds the starting of engines. On the foredeck, the aircrew watch them away, heavily laden, circling the ship before setting off the 90 miles to the islands. For the first time since leaving Portsmouth, the deck is empty and silent. The main attack is on the airport at Port Stanley to stop transport planes bringing in troop reinforcements or Mirage fighters using it as a forward base. But there's a second attack on the other side of the main island at Goose Green, where a landing strip has been prepared in a grass field. "40 minutes later, they're back, dropping down from the sky, each one counted in by anxious eyes. They all return, unhurt and happy. Only one plane has any damage, a single shot through the tail. It's much better than they'd feared. They'd agreed between them they might lose as many as a quarter of the planes. Instead, they're back, talking cheerfully about how it went. The pilot with the hole in his tail was also on loan from the RAF.
It was just about as we planned, with one or two little hiccups. Obviously the first time any of us have done anything like that, although we've practiced a lot in the past. The plan worked.
A lot of heavy fire?
Yes, a great deal. Obviously no one has actually seen it before, but as we crested over the ridge to run into the airfield, there was a complete blanket of exploding AAA shells at a couple of 100 feet, and a lot of visually laid AAA actually firing at us on the run-in.
How did you feel going into that? Did it give you pause for thought, or are you not able to think when you're moving fast?
Well, for about 2 seconds it scared me fartless, and then after that we just had to concentrate on the job in hand, because we all knew what we had to do, we knew which routes we were taking, and it was just a question of getting as low as you could, weaving around what flank you could, and putting the weapons on the target.
What were you putting down and where?
I took 3 CBUs, and my brief was to run in from the northern end of the airfield across the runway and spread them across the runway into the domestic side, into the aircraft pan.
And could you get any idea how well you'd succeeded?
Yes, I think my first bomb probably took out an aircraft which was on the northern side of the airfield, a little light aircraft, and then the remaining 2 rolled across the airfield into the pan, which was actually full of smoke and flames already at this stage.
What did it look like?
The airfield itself was just the airport buildings were just a very large area of fire and smoke and dust. You couldn't actually pick out very little detail in there because there was so much.
Could you see people on the ground?
No, you couldn't see any people. I think they were all pretty well down foxholes, but you could see a lot of guns firing.
And you got a hole in your tail?
Yes, that's right.
Did you know about it?
I felt it, yes. I didn't know where it had hit. Just as I was dropping the weapons, there was a large thump from behind me. I knew I'd been hit, and the tail started vibrating.
The plane was okay for flying, though?
Yes, it was flying quite normally, apart from the vibration from the back end. So I just ran out as quickly and as low as I could, and then pulled up and came back at a reasonable height.
And what did you think when you went round and looked at the damage when you were down?
I was quite surprised it was such a large hole, I must admit. I knew there was something in the tail because of the vibration through the pedals. But it was quite a large hole, and it was lucky it was through that bit and not a little bit further back.
A reconnaissance photograph taken later in the day showed the neat line of bombs from the Vulcan. Blind bombing from 3,500 miles, it had achieved its object. One bomb on the runway. While the raid was going on, one of the Harriers in the first wave took pictures of the later bombs going off. Some were high explosive, others were cluster bombs, a shrapnel weapon intended to penetrate armored vehicles, radar installations, planes, and people. No sooner were the Harriers back than they were being refueled and rearmed as fighters. With just 20 of them in the fleet, the Harrier's versatility is being exploited to the full. For the rest of the day, the Argentine Air Force probed the edge of our defences, and the deck was a continuous bustle, keeping the Harriers airborne to meet the threat. At low level, the pilots say the Harrier is a match for almost any aircraft in combat. By the end of the day, they proved it. 3 aircraft, 2 Mirage and a Canberra, had been shot down. In the evening, Glamorgan led a group of ships up to bombard the coast. They were attacked from the air, but showed little sign of damage afterwards. The first day had gone Britain's way. So did the second, but without the task force ships doing anything. Below the seas, Britain's nuclear submarines had been waiting for weeks. On Sunday, one of them torpedoed an Argentine cruiser outside the exclusion zone. Hermes executive officer, Commander John Locke, told the ship's company over the main broadcast.
The Belgrado, the Argentinian cruiser, has been torpedoed to the south of the Falkland Islands by one of our SSNs, and in addition, as a result of a seeking surface detection to the north of the Falklands, we launched some Lynx helicopters which carried out a successful missile attack on this particular contact.
On the ships, as elsewhere in the world, there was much debate about extending the zone of conflict, and among sailors, sadness at the loss of life. But now there was a sudden change of fortune. A column of smoke on the horizon showed where HMS Sheffield, one of the Navy's most modern destroyers, was hit by an Exocet missile. One missile capable of destroying a ship. From the deck of Hermes, helicopters were scrambled to offer assistance. They were loaded up with firefighting equipment and pumps. Sheffield had no power to put out the fire that was destroying her. Doctors went too, but there was little for them to do. The few serious casualties were brought back to Hermes and rushed below to the sickbay. The escorting frigate maneuvered about us, continually putting its missiles between us and the likely attack, changing station as the direction of the threat varied. While the battle to save Sheffield went on, 3 Harriers took off on another bombing raid to Goose Green. Only 2 returned, another blow to the task force. A trickle of Sheffield crewmen continued to come aboard the flagship with minor injuries. They were dazed, but walking from the helicopters with the assistance of the medical orderlies. After 5 hours, the ship was abandoned to the fire. The sea was as calm as the day she was hit, the flat surface making it easy for the Argentine pilot to fly low, avoiding radar detection. The missile had been spotted just seconds before it struck. The captain of Sheffield was Sam Salt.
I can tell you that we're talking about seconds to react rather than minutes. And I'm sure you will appreciate that a missile which comes in less than 12 feet off the deck at very high speed, many hundreds of miles an hour, gives us a very short time of response. And we saw it at a stage at which there was really no time to do anything other than for those who were in the immediate vicinity of the small number of people who saw this missile appearing, only had time to say take cover. And we're talking about 3 or 4 seconds later the missile striking HMS Sheffield.
How much effect did it have?
Devastating. It hit the center of the ship, which is the center of all operation, both mechanical and detection and weapon system-wise, about 6 feet above the water level. Damaged 2 large compartments, and when inside the ship, exploded, and exploded outwards and upwards. And we're actually talking about 15 to 20 seconds, I know it sounds incredible, but 15 to 20 seconds before the whole of the working area of the ship, and I'm talking about 1/3 of the ship, the center portion, was filled by black, acrid, pungent smoke. My overriding impression throughout the 5 hours that we tried to fight this damage.
5 hours?
5 hours, through which we tried to fight this damage, was of immense calm, common sense, and careful thinking by really every member of the ship's company.
What was it that finally made you decide to give up that fight, to abandon the ship?
I think we started thinking that we were on a losing wicket when we realized the fire was spreading. The decks were hot on the upper deck. You could feel the heat of the deck through your feet with shoes on. The superstructure was steaming. Paint on the ship's side was coming off. The area around the initial area where the missile penetrated the hull was glowing red. It was white hot and red hot. The flames we could see coming out of the hole. The extent of damage was such that we knew that there is no way in that class of submarine, that class of ship, that you can possibly fight that ship again with that amount of damage.
It would have been useless if you'd saved it.
Even if we saved it and went back on board, there is no way that that ship could positively contribute to this group.
You went back later by helicopter to see it. Even then, you were certain you'd made the right decision to abandon.
I have no doubt at all, I'm afraid. We went back by helicopter about 7 hours after the explosion, and the whole of the center section was a roaring mass of flame. That is the whole of the working area of the ship.
It was your decision to abandon the ship?
Yes, it was.
How did you feel when you gave that order?
Awful.
You'd known the ship some time?
Yes. Not as long as the rest of the ship's company, because I only joined it abroad in January. But the rest of that ship's company had been together for a long time. It's a very good ship. I'm sure every captain would say that their ship's company is the best afloat. But I certainly believe that mine was.
Captain,
I'd just like to finish, if I could, and say that the other part of the decision to abandon was the fact that we were taking part, or taking the attention of other ships and units in the area at a time when we were subject to attack. We had no hope of retrieving the fighting capability of that ship. The fire had extended to an extent that was dangerous with regard to our own ammunition, magazines, and missile magazines. And the ship's company, all of them, were on the upper deck and had been on the upper deck in very cold conditions for 5 hours. We were not winning that fire, beating it, we were losing.
Only 4 of the ship's company had to stay in the Hermes sickbay. They needed treatment for burns. I found them all remarkably cheerful and resilient, even the one most seriously hurt. He'd been in the same compartment as the missile when it exploded. Somehow he'd got out alive. Aboard Hermes, the lessons of the Sheffield were studied. All doors and hatches were kept closed, restricting movement about the ship, but also ensuring that fire and smoke couldn't spread after an attack. Many of the crew slept at their action stations to speed responses further. In any case, nobody was allowed to sleep below the waterline, so for many, it was a choice of borrowing a bunk from somebody else or spreading a mattress on the floor. 2 days after the loss of Sheffield, there was more bad news. Thursday, May the 6th, and another bad day for the task force. 2 Harriers from Invincible have gone off in this mist, and they haven't come back. They disappeared from the radar trace simultaneously, so it looks as though they collided rather than were shot down. But that means we have now lost 3 Harriers since the start of the action, and that's a rate of loss which is unacceptable. More Harriers are being brought down by the RAF, but for the moment, the Harriers here on the ships are all that the Navy has available to it. But worsening weather brought clearer skies, sending the ships closer into the shore and the Harriers back in the air to squeeze the blockade tighter, harrying supply ships and aircraft, shelling Argentine positions. All part of the continuing pressure to prepare for an invasion or force Argentina to negotiate an acceptable solution. At the end of a week of war, the reckoning in the fleet was that Argentina was paying a heavier price than Britain.
Brian Hanrahan's first film report of action in the South Atlantic. The BBC film crew with him were cameraman Bernard Hesketh and sound recordist John Jockle. The crew of the Sea King helicopter discovered in southern Chile last week have been found safe and well. They're now in the Chilean capital, Santiago, and are expected to fly back to London in the next few hours. The 3 men, led by the pilot, Lieutenant Alan Bennett from Yeovilton in Somerset, were picked up near the port of Punta Arenas. They'd been in hiding and had only just realised they weren't in Argentina.
The crew hid out in icy forests, sleeping under logs, living off survival kit rations and thriving on them. With Navy-issue sheath knives, they tried and failed to kill rabbits. The crew climbed trees to evade Chileans passing on horseback. There were compasses, but no maps, and no one spoke Spanish. And all the time, the Britons thought they were in enemy territory, Argentina. The secret mission started from HMS Hermes off the Falklands on Monday, May the 17th. The Sea King, probably carrying commandos, headed for Argentina, but had engine and navigation trouble and strayed over Chile. The lost helicopter landed on this beach. Thinking they were in Argentina, the crew set alight the fuel tanks and ran to the hills. The next day, the bewildered Chileans found the wreckage, burned it, and buried the remains under this mound. Many officials thought the crew had been spirited out of Chile by intelligence agents or submarine. The drama ended when the Britons saw a road sign marked Republic of Chile. They gave themselves up at a police training camp. Grateful for their kind treatment, they presented their compasses and few possessions to their Chilean hosts. And the Chileans bought them civilian clothes for the journey home, starting with a secret flight by military transport to Santiago. All 3 are in good shape and fine spirits.
Sailors' wives from Gosport in Hampshire, where many naval families live, are unhappy about the flow of information from the task force. As Andy Webb reports, their concern was heightened by the news that the Coventry had been lost.
Saturday morning you could have given a list of ships that had been hit, telling us that all the next of kin had been informed. But I must admit, I think you've handled this cruelly. I really do.
The Gosport constituency of Mr. Peter Viggers contains hardly a family without some link with the services. 5 of the men who died aboard HMS Sheffield were from the town, and the tension which local families have to bear was evident as news of the loss of HMS Coventry reached the meeting.
Coventry, that's just what they said on the news just now. Oh, Jesus, my friends. Well, Sue Patterson, she's pregnant. Yeah. When did she have a baby? July. Oh, God.
I don't know. I just heard that and I was thinking about stuff, and then it said Atlantic, and I turned the radio off, which was silly, but I was thinking I wanted to tell Sue, and I didn't know if you'd still be here, you see. This was one. But it just said the Coventry's being lost. Not said anything about casualties.
There were calls for more specific information on casualties and damage to ships. Some wives felt that to hear only half the story was worse than nothing at all.
How many wives from all those destroyers have been waiting all night to find out now that it has been that one ship?
Yes.
Oh, it's from what, 10:15 last night? Yeah, well, it was on the 9 o'clock news, wasn't it? Yeah, so that a ship had gone. But all this time waiting.
There were those who accepted the difficulties facing ministry spokesmen and the Neighbours Information Service. But Mr Viggers said there were clearly areas for concern.
They want to be told. They don't want to be told that a ship has been hit, and then hear that the ship has been hit badly, and then find out later what the name of the ship is. The message I've had loud and clear today is they want to be told. And if necessary, they are prepared to hear names of ships and numbers of injuries by television or by radio. They don't want to be protected, cocooned. They're grown up and they want to be...
Here's Captain Salt. Can you sit down?
Sorry?
Hello.
No, come on.
It was a bit of a struggle, isn't it?
That's all right.
We're on
That's
it.
good. Hope so.
Gentlemen, could you give us all a glance, please, before you start speaking?
Right, gentlemen, good morning to you. And before I or you start talking, can I just introduce the team that is with me? On my... Yes, certainly. On my left, I have Commander Bob Rowley, who is my Marine Engineer Officer. Next to me on my right, I have Chief Operations Missileman Charles Adamson, and you old hands will know him as a Chief GI, and Chief Electrical Mechanician Mike Smith on his right, who's the Senior Technician in charge, basically, of heavy electrics. And I think what I would like to do, if I may, is start off by, before you ask your questions, making a brief statement on the attack which occurred on HMS Sheffield on the 4th of May. I'm afraid much of what I say I'm going to read because having just completed a 10-hour flight, I'm not at my sharpest, and if I don't read it, then the words will come up back to front and upside down. They probably will do anyhow, but forgive me if they do. Before I start the account, I would like to say that we arrive in the UK, obviously, with mixed feelings. We have real happiness for being reunited with our families, and please remember we have been away as a ship from the UK since the 17th of November. We feel great sympathy for our families, or rather the families of those of our friends on board who lost their lives during the attack. We feel deep sorrow for the loss of our ship, for which we had great affection. We feel considerable anger that we were struck in the first place. We feel particularly frustration that we're not still fighting alongside the task force. And finally, we are, of course, deeply upset by the other losses that have occurred in the Falklands struggle since our own. And now if I can give you just a brief summary of the attack, that'll set the scene for your questions if you wish to ask any afterwards. The attack occurred about 3 hours after sunrise and was carried out by 2 aircraft who approached at low level. I don't intend to go into details of the detection, except to confirm what I've already said, that the warning that we had of attack was very short, and the first indication we had that a missile had in fact been fired at us was when the missile was seen visibly low against the horizon. I have never met anybody that's been on the receiving end of an Exocet missile before. I know this is the first time for the RN that this has happened, and it's probably true of most Western navies as well. Therefore, from that point of view, in every sense, this was a very new experience. Whilst the missile that we saw was fired from our starboard side, the other aircraft in the group of two appears to have fired at us from our port side another Exocet missile, which in fact missed. The missile that we saw hit us on the starboard side, amidships, and entered a large machinery space, and after impact, it exploded into the engine room next to it and upwards into the galley area on the deck above. It caused a rent in the ship's side, approximately 15 feet long and 4 feet deep, and near instantaneous major fires in all these areas. It may be of some comfort that those who lost their lives